Nona Dirksmeyer was born on December 26, 1985, in Russellville, Arkansas. She grew up in a very large family. She had 4 brothers and 1 sister. When Nona was 10 years old, her father passed away. This event was a tragedy for the entire family, but they were soon to face an even more terrible shock. Sometime later, the young woman confessed to her mother that her father had repeatedly subjected her to violence. She was afraid to speak up while he was alive, and her confession was a real shock to her mother. The woman had no idea what her husband was capable of. Despite such a tragic experience, Nona found the strength to move on and later decided to help other young women who had become victims of similar crimes. For this, she joined a volunteer organization where she provided support to children in need. During her school years, Nona began dating a guy named Kevin Jones. The young woman also took part in beauty contests, achieving significant success in this field. Nona won several local contests, which allowed her to compete for the title of Miss Arkansas. In addition, the young woman actively participated in the life of the local church and sang in the choir. After high school, when Nona was 19, she and her boyfriend enrolled in Arkansas Tech University, located in their hometown. The young woman decided to rent her own apartment as she wanted to start an independent life. After completing her first year, her boyfriend decided to change his major and transferred to another university, which was an hour-and-a-half drive from their city. By that time, the couple had been dating for about 5 years, and it was their first time they had to live in different cities. On December 14, 2005, Kevin returned home for Christmas holidays. He stopped by Nona's apartment before heading to his parents' home, which was about 16 kilometers away from the city. The next day, both of them had plans. Nona had to take her last 2 exams and also meet with a young woman from the volunteer organization. Kevin was going to take his mom, who worked as a librarian, to a school event. On the morning of December 15th, at around 9 a.m., Nona sent a message to Kevin, wishing him a good day. He was waiting for Nona to call him after her exams and let him know how they went, but she wasn't answering his calls or messages, and he began to worry. Around 6 p.m., Kevin took his mother to the school event, but he couldn't shake the thought. Why isn't Nona answering her phone all day? Eventually, Kevin decided to call his friend who worked as a pizza delivery guy in the area where Nona's apartment complex was located. Kevin asked him to stop by and check if everything was okay. His friend quickly arrived there and saw that Nona's car was parked in the parking lot, and the lights were on in her apartment, but nobody was answering the door. He told Kevin about this, and then Kevin told his mother that he was worried about his girlfriend and wanted to go to her apartment to check if everything was okay. The woman agreed, and they went to the apartment complex together. Kevin's friend was waiting for them there, and all 3 of them started knocking on the door, but there was still no answer. Kevin had a key, but he left it at home that day because he didn't plan on stopping by Nona's. A few minutes later, Kevin and his friend tried to open the front door because they thought something bad might have happened to Nona, but they couldn't get in. Then Kevin remembered that there were sliding glass doors in the back of the apartment. Approaching them, he immediately noticed something strange. Nona took her safety seriously, so every time she was home alone, she put a special removable grill on the back glass door. They are mainly used against burglars. They are easy to install and remove from inside the house, but it's extremely difficult to do so from the outside. But this time, there was no grill, and the doors themselves were unlocked. Once inside the apartment, they immediately noticed blood on the blinds, and a shocking sight awaited them in the bedroom. Nona was lying face down in a pool of blood, wearing nothing but socks. Kevin rushed to her and tried to lift her, but immediately realized she was dead. Meanwhile, his mother called the police. Investigators arrived at the apartment and began examining the crime scene. They immediately suspected that the victim had been struck multiple times on the head with a table lamp that was found on the floor. They also discovered a bloody fingerprint on the lamp, which they believed may have been left by the killer. Next to the victim's body, they found her phone with the battery removed. On the bedside table, investigators found an empty condom wrapper. After examining all the doors and windows, they found no signs of forced entry. Medical examiners studied the victim's body and confirmed that the table lamp had been used as a weapon, with the metal base of the lamp matching the victim's head injuries. In addition, the victim had multiple knife wounds. According to the pathologist, the victim had died between 10:30 a.m. and 1 p.m., and there were no signs of violence, which puzzled the detectives, considering that the victim was found without clothing. They first suspected a sexual motive for the crime. However, experts suggested that the perpetrator may have used a condom, the wrapper of which was found in the apartment, making it practically impossible to determine the presence of sexual violence. In the end, the police had no evidence, but one interesting detail emerged. The crime scene was not thoroughly examined, with investigators failing to collect blood samples from the blinds on the back door or a search for shoe prints in the apartment, which could have been used as evidence. Moreover, they didn't even go to the second floor of the apartment. These oversights were explained by the fact that the investigators found their suspect, the victim's boyfriend, almost immediately after arriving at the scene. The first thing that made them suspect Kevin's involvement in the murder was the fact that he had a large amount of the victim's blood on him. When he entered the apartment and ran to her, he tried to lift her up, and upon realizing that she was dead, he hugged and held her. The police found this behavior strange and suspected that Kevin had done it deliberately. By hugging the victim and getting covered in her blood, he may have destroyed potential evidence and compromised the crime scene. Why it would be difficult for investigators to prove his guilt, for example, if Kevin's clothes or nails were found with the victim's blood, it could easily be explained that he hugged the victim after discovering her body. Another suspicious moment was that Kevin went to check on his girlfriend, not alone, but with his mother, and he also invited his friend to the apartment. Investigators believed that this way he secured two witnesses who found the body with him and saw him covered in blood. The police talked to Kevin for a long time right outside Nona's apartment, and from their questions, the young man realized that they considered him a suspect. Then he said something that made the investigators even more convinced that he was the killer. Understanding that he was suspected, Kevin began arguing with the investigators and mentioned that he constantly watches Law and Order and knows that they are trying to make him guilty. These words also seemed strange to the police. In addition, they found out that the key to Nona's apartment was only with 3 people: the girlfriend herself, her mother, and Kevin. Considering that no signs of breaking in were found, they assumed that the guy used his copy of the key to enter the apartment. Kevin was taken to the police station for interrogation. For several hours, he told his version of events that day and insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder. In turn, investigators directly accused him of this and urged him to confess. During the interrogation, another fact emerged that the police considered strange. Around 4 p.m., after numerous attempts to call his girlfriend, Kevin sent a message: "Are you alive?" Given at that time Nona was already dead, the investigators found this suspicious. While the guy did not demand a lawyer and tried to answer all questions, the investigators talked to him for several hours, constantly increasing pressure. Towards the end, they not only accused him of the murder directly, but also manipulated the facts. Detectives said several times that there was incontrovertible evidence against him, and the only way to lighten his fate was to confess to everything. After the police left the interrogation room and left him alone, Kevin stood up and started punching the back of the chair. For the investigators, this became another sign that the young man had a tendency to violence and could commit murder. However, in reality, the police had no evidence that could link Kevin to the murder. Medical experts found that Nona had tried to fend off her attacker, meaning that there should have been bruises and scratches on the killer's body, but none were found on Kevin. Despite this, the detectives continued to believe he was guilty and tried to find evidence. They interviewed over 50 people, hoping to find any witnesses, but it yielded no results. However, after talking with Nona's friends, the police learned something important. It turned out that shortly before her death, she had started seeing another guy secretly from Kevin. Investigators immediately checked this person, but he had a solid alibi for the time of the murder, and this fact added even more suspicion to Kevin because now he had a motive. The young man could have come to Nona's house without warning, seen an empty contraceptive package, and realized that she was cheating on him. In a fit of rage, he could have killed her and then fled the scene and planned a way to avoid responsibility. This version was consistent with the nature of the injuries inflicted on the victim. She was killed with particular cruelty, which in most similar cases indicates strong personal animosity of the killer towards the victim. A few days later, Kevin agreed to undergo a polygraph test. The operator concluded that the young man gave numerous false answers, and one of the investigators even claimed that this was the worst result on a polygraph in his 28-year career. However, there was one caveat here. The person who read the device's readings was not a certified specialist. He was just a police officer who had not undergone the necessary training to work with this device. But this did not bother the detectives. After the interrogation, they again put pressure on Kevin, trying to force a confession. They claimed that all his acquaintances and relatives already knew that he killed Nona. The police really told everyone that Kevin's guilt was practically proven and that he would soon be arrested. They convinced the victim's parents that he was the one who killed their daughter, although they refused to believe it until the end. The day before the funeral, a farewell ceremony was supposed to take place in the church, and Kevin had been helping to organize it since early in the morning. Later on, detectives called him in for questioning again, promising to release him before the start of the ceremony. In the end, Kevin spent 7 hours at the police station and missed the ceremony. Nobody present knew he was being questioned, so many assumed that Kevin didn't show up due to guilt over what had happened. Nona's parents didn't even want him to come to the funeral, as investigators had already convinced them of his involvement in the murder. But Kevin still came and sat far away from her relatives. By that time, experts had finished examining the evidence that the police had taken from the victim's apartment. Upon inspecting the light bulb and the desk lamp, they found a fingerprint that belonged to Kevin. It had been left by Nona's blood, which indicated that the fingerprint could only have been made during or after the murder. This became the only available evidence for the investigators, but they continued to dig under Kevin for several more months, hoping to find more evidence. They were unable to do so, and on March 31, 2006, they decided to try to obtain a conviction with the available evidence. The young man was arrested and charged with murder. At that time, many residents still believed that he was guilty, so Kevin's lawyers first requested a change of venue to another district. They were concerned that the jurors might be negatively predisposed against their client and render a guilty verdict without sufficient evidence. This request was granted, and the trial began in another city. The defense called a witness who provided Kevin with a solid alibi. A plumber had come to his parents' house that morning and saw him there around 10:30 a.m. The prosecution insisted that Kevin could have had time to go to Nona's and commit the murder, as, according to medical experts, she had died between 10:30 a.m. and 1 p.m. They also presented an interesting fact. Kevin's phone had been turned off between 10:30 a.m. and 12 p.m. This time frame coincided with the time of the victim's murder. Furthermore, data from Kevin's phone showed that he only started calling his girlfriend at 4:30 p.m., although during questioning, he claimed that he had been trying to contact her all day. However, at that time, the young man may have meant not only calls but also messages. Lawyers presented two more witnesses whose testimony disproved the possibility of Kevin committing the murder. One of them was Kevin's grandmother. She said that on that day she saw her grandson near the gas station and gave him some money to have a snack at a cafe. Another witness saw the guy between 12:30 and 1 p.m. near the restaurant, and the establishment's cameras recorded him having lunch. Thus, the young man simply could not have committed the murder and returned back in time. Lawyers also challenged the fact that Kevin could have left a bloody fingerprint on the lamp during the murder. In that case, by the time the body was discovered, the blood should have dried up, and the experts who came to the apartment that evening wrote in the report that the bloody fingerprint was slightly damp, confirming that Kevin could have left it accidentally when he found Nona's body with his mother and friend. But that's not all. It turned out that based on the table lamp, which was used to hit the victim, fingerprints were also found, but they did not belong to Kevin, and checking them against the databases did not yield any results. Lawyers insisted that these fingerprints belonged to the real killer. Lawyers also pointed out that the police did a very poor job from the first minutes. They did not inspect the entire apartment, which could have missed many potential clues. At the trial, a medical expert who examined the victim's body spoke, and here an interesting statement awaited all participants in the process. He determined that after death, the victim's body lay on her back for some time, after which she was turned face down. This could indicate that the young woman was still subjected to violence. The expert confirmed that he did not find any direct signs of this, but added that he could not rule out such a scenario. Finally, lawyers presented the main trump card. According to the official statement of the prosecution, no fingerprints or DNA were found on the empty contraceptive package found next to the victim's body, but lawyers ordered a retest, and this time, the experts found male DNA. The analysis showed that it did not belong to Kevin, and checking it against the databases did not yield any results. The trial lasted over a year, but in July 2007, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Kevin not guilty of the murder of Nona due to lack of evidence. For the victim's relatives, who had believed him to be the killer from the first weeks, this decision was a shock. They continued to believe that Kevin was responsible for her death, and now he had managed to avoid punishment. Despite their client being acquitted, the legal team promised to continue working on the case and find the real killer. Considering that the police were fixated on Kevin, no one expected them to finally do their job properly. The first thing the lawyers did was to get the DNA from the contraceptive packaging compared to all the men who knew Nona. All these people voluntarily provided their samples, and none of them matched. This went on for 2 months, until something unexpected happened in September 2007. The police arrested a man named Gary Dunn for robbery, and that's when things got interesting. Firstly, this man had already been convicted for attacking another woman. Secondly, he lived in the same residential complex as Nona. Thirdly, in the early stages of the investigation, The police considered him a suspect, but quickly switched their focus to Kevin as they believed he was the killer. Given all this, the boy's lawyers requested a DNA test, and there was a long-awaited breakthrough. The sample from the contraceptive packaging matched Gary's DNA. It turned out that after the young woman's murder, investigators even questioned him using a polygraph. Gary, who was 26 at the time, passed it completely, even though in that case, the interrogation was also conducted by a non-certified specialist. Moreover, none of them even checked this person's alibi. Then, Gary said that during the murder, he was shopping with his mother. After his DNA matched the sample from the victim's apartment, investigators finally bothered to check this information, and the alibi turned out to be false. Gary really went shopping with his mother, just not at the time of the murder, but 2 days before that, as confirmed by the receipts with the purchase dates, and Gary even showed them to the police, but they simply disregarded such important information. They saw the dates on the checks did not match the day of the murder. This was stated in the reports, but for some unknown reason, they either did not attach importance to this or somehow did not notice that the days did not match. In the end, experts compared his fingerprints with those found on Nona's table lamp, and they matched. However, a serious problem arose here. The fingerprints and DNA matched, but not 100%. The judicial system has certain norms according to which the necessary coincidence indicators are established for guilt recognition. In Gary's case, these indicators were insufficient. Although there were practically no chances that the DNA and fingerprints belonged to someone else, and here, with a high degree of probability, the investigators were guilty. Firstly, they did not study all the available evidence immediately after the murder, as the rules require. It is possible that the DNA samples deteriorated slightly while it was not properly studied a year after the murder. Secondly, the police could have missed many other clues because they simply did not search the entire apartment. As soon as the detectives received all this information, they arrested Gary and charged him with Nona's murder. Interestingly, at the time of her death, the man was on parole. In 2002, he attacked a woman who was running in the park, knocked her down and started beating her, also telling her that he was going to kill her. The woman managed to escape and ran to her car. Meanwhile, Gary fled the scene but was quickly found. The man spent 19 months in prison, after which he was released early. Interestingly, his DNA sample was not entered into the database. The trial of Gary began in April 2010, and there were many interesting things waiting for everyone. His own wife testified against him, saying that he was an aggressive and dangerous man. Gary regularly raised his hand against her, and the woman seriously feared for her life, so she was afraid to leave him. But the most interesting thing was that a few weeks before the victim's death, she saw her husband spying on Nona through the window of her apartment. Based on this, the prosecution assumed that the man had premeditated the attack. Given his criminal history, Gary clearly had a tendency towards violence, and he may have been keeping a close eye on Nona since she lived just a few meters away from him. On December 15th, he decided to act. Apparently, he knocked on her apartment door and came inside under a false pretense, where he grabbed a table lamp and struck her several times before assaulting and killing her. Because Gary used contraception, medical experts could not definitively say whether the victim had been sexually assaulted, but all the evidence pointed to it. Gary's lawyers denied his involvement, but he had no real alibi, so they focused on trying to blame Kevin. According to the lawyers, Kevin found out that the young woman was cheating on him and killed her. Kevin even had to testify in court and listen as they tried to paint him as the true criminal. Unfortunately, the prosecution could not use Gary's fingerprint or DNA as evidence, even though the match was practically undeniable. As a result, the jury could not come to a unanimous decision, and the trial was declared a mistrial. A new trial was not far behind, and its key difference was that a woman who Gary had nearly killed in 2002 testified in court. She told how the man had attacked her and how she barely managed to escape. But despite this, the second trial also ended in nothing, as the jurors did not reach a consensus. Consequently, Gary Dunn walked free as a free man, although his guilt was practically obvious. But a few years later, he did earn himself a prison sentence. In 2018, when Gary was 39, he committed 2 separate crimes in one day. First, he attempted to kidnap a woman from a church parking lot, but she managed to fight him off. A few hours later, Gary stripped down in front of another woman in a mall parking lot and was soon arrested. Given his criminal history and the fact that he is practically a killer of Nona, the court decided to sentence him to the maximum term. Gary received 15 years in prison for these 2 incidents, and he is serving his sentence to this day. Despite having the right to petition for early release, authorities are unlikely to grant Gary such an opportunity. Additionally, they have the right to accuse him of Nona's murder for the 3rd time, but they're not rushing to do so. The likelihood of the new trial ending in the same way as the previous 2 is very high, so investigators are trying to gather more evidence and prepare a stronger case against Gary. As for Kevin, after everything that happened, he pursued a study of law, and in 2011, he sued 2 police officers from the authorities of Russellville and Gary Dunn. He claimed that they were trying to pin someone else's crime on him, ignoring many clues and refusing to do their job properly. During the preparation for the trial, Kevin found out that, in fact, Gary's polygraph test results also showed lies, but investigators still did not consider him a suspect. Unfortunately, his lawsuit was dismissed due to the statute of limitations. As a result, negligent police officers did not face any consequences for letting the real killer roam free for years and may be there again in a few years. They will also not be punished for the fact that all acquaintances and relatives of Nona believed for years that Kevin was the murderer. Only a few years ago, her parents stopped believing this and restored their relationship with him. Now, Kevin works as a lawyer and strives to help those who suffer from police negligence or unprofessionalism. Mary Ann Vestra was born on August 10, 1982, in the Netherlands. She lived with her parents in De Westreen, a small village in the north of the country, far from large cities. The young woman was the youngest of 6 children. She had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. Over time, almost all of the older children left for other cities and countries, and Mary Ann was left to live with her parents and 1 older brother. The young woman studied at the local school, was fond of music, and had many friends. The area where she lived was dotted with small towns and settlements located a few kilometers apart. For this reason, Mary Ann often went to other localities to spend time with friends or go shopping. In her free time, she also worked at the local supermarket as a part-time employee. On April 30th, 1999, the country celebrated a big holiday, Queen's Day. Mary Ann finished her shift at the store and went to a nearby town called Colum to spend the evening with her friends at a local cafe. A few hours later, their company was joined by Mary Ann's boyfriend and his friends, and together they all decided to go to a settlement called Boykenpost, which was 6 kilometers away. The group rode there on their bicycles, but Mary Ann did not have one, so she borrowed a bicycle and went for a ride with her friends. After a while, they decided to go home, and the young woman headed in the direction of her town, which was about 11 kilometers away. But she never made it home. Her parents thought that Mary Ann had stayed the night with a friend who lived in Colum, although this was doubtful. The young woman had promised to be home by evening, and if she had decided to spend the night at her friend's, she would certainly have called home. Early in the morning, Marianne's father called at the house of her best friend, Affy. To his surprise, he heard that his daughter had said goodbye to her friend that night and headed home. At this point, it became clear to everyone that something bad might have happened to Marianne. Her friend called her boyfriend, took her sister with her, and together they drove along the route Marianne took home. Meanwhile, the young woman's father decided to go to the police immediately. He told them that his daughter had not returned home and none of her friends knew where she was. Soon, 2 officers arrived to take a missing persons report, after which they returned to the station and prepared to begin their search. Meanwhile, Affy and her sister and boyfriend were driving near the settlement of Finkleister with vast fields on either side of the road. At one point, they noticed something shiny in the grass and stopped. As they approached the field, they saw a bicycle lying in the grass. A little further away, about 15 meters away, was the awful sight of Marianne laying there. She had no clothes on, and there was a cut on her neck. All 3 were shocked. Affy wanted to check Marianne's pulse, but could not bring herself to approach the body. It was obvious that the young woman was dead, but her best friend couldn't believe it because of the intense shock. She struggled to get her phone out and called the police. Several officers arrived on the scene at once, and 2 police officers went to Marianne's family home. At the time, they did not yet have official confirmation of the victim's identity, so the officers picked up her father and drove him to the scene. Forensic investigators were already on the scene at the time, and the father, to his grief, immediately identified Marianne. After examining the scene, the detective noticed an important detail. There were 2 bicycle tracks leading from the road to the place where the young woman's body was lying, and only 1 track in the opposite direction. That meant the killer was also on a bicycle. The police searched the surrounding area for clues and even conducted aerial photography, but the only thing they could find near the murder scene was a lighter. Marianne's friend stated that she did not smoke and did not have a lighter, so the police sent her to the lab. Medical examiners determined that the young woman had been abused and found traces of semen, from which they were able to compile a sample of the killer's DNA. The same DNA was found on the lighter. It was uploaded to the police database, but there was no matches. This meant that the perpetrator had no previous criminal record. Almost immediately after the body was found, the police chose a Marianne boyfriend named Spencer as a suspect. There was no evidence against him, but it seemed to the head of the local police department that the boy was the most likely killer in such a case. However, the young man voluntarily provided his DNA sample, and it did not match the one found on the victim's body. In the meantime, the crime had been covered extensively in the local media and on television. In that quiet and peaceful area, such murders were almost unheard of, and the public demanded that the police catch the culprit as soon as possible. The problem was that detectives were already deadlocked within the first week. They had a DNA sample of the killer, but no suspects. The police also received numerous calls from local residents. Some of them thought someone they knew might be behind the murder, but there was no confirmation of any of those theories. But the vast majority of people pointed to one specific place. Near the field where Marianne's body was found was a migration center for people who had applied for asylum. Most of the people there were from Iran and Syria. With each passing day, this theory spread through the local towns, and at one point, an impressive number of people were 100% certain that a refugee had committed the murder. Because of this, the police had to investigate this possibility. On May 5th, Marianne's funeral was held. Almost 1,500 people came to support her family at that moment, many from neighboring communities. 2 days later, the woman's parents organized a memorial procession, at the end of which they addressed the public. A total of about 20,000 people took part in the event, mostly due to the active national coverage of the case. More and more people contacted the police each day, and at one point the detectives got a really interesting lead. Several people reported seeing Marianne at a cafe one night as a certain Oriental-looking guy approached her and tried to get to know her. After the young woman refused, the guy made a gesture toward her with his thumb along her throat. Given that the young woman was killed in this manner, the police immediately began searching for the young man. He turned out to be a 15-year-old refugee from the same migration center. He admitted that he had indeed made such a gesture, but denied any involvement in the murder. The boy gave a DNA sample, and it did not match the one found on the victim's body. Despite this, local residents continued to blame the refugees from the migration center. The organization even had to hire additional security guards in case of possible conflicts. 12 days after the murder, people came out to the migration center to protest. At first, they simply shouted out demands to give them the murderer, but by evening the situation had escalated greatly. Several people threw Molotov cocktails in the direction of the building, forcing the police to intervene. Since then, security at the center has been significantly stepped up, and there have been no more demonstrations of this kind. A few days later, the police announced the arrest of a 32-year-old man named Pitt, who lived in the same town as Marianne. He was a local alcoholic and was disliked by most of the residents. The arrest came after a witness contacted the police that he had seen Pitt in bloody clothes the night of the murder. The man was detained and his DNA sample was sent to the lab. Almost instantly, journalists spread the word nationwide about the new suspect, except the DNA didn't match the sample, and the witness admitted to making up the whole story in retaliation against Pitt for a personal grudge. Investigating a possible connection to the immigration center, police began examining the logbook, which records all movements of refugees from the asylum area. They had the right to leave the center, but to do so, they had to check the log and indicate where they were going and why. It turned out that 2 refugees had left the center on the night of the murder, but had not indicated where they were going. They were 26-year-old Ali and 19-year-old Mohammed. Police began looking into their possible involvement, but no details were released for a long time. Marianne's father was unhappy that investigators were keeping his family in the dark and still hadn't found the killer. He contacted a well-known crime reporter who agreed to take over the case and tried to find more information. On July 1st, the father of the victim appeared on a popular television program where he voiced the facts discovered by the journalist. First, the 2 refugees who left the center on the night of the murder were in the same cafe as Marianne. They also left almost immediately after the young woman left with her friends. Second, since that very night, the whereabouts of these men have been unknown. They had not returned to the center and the police could not find them. At the same time, they had photographs of both men, but for some reason, the authorities did not publish them. After all these facts were made public on television, the police stated that they were currently searching for these suspects together with Interpol. The main theory is that they may have fled the country. All this has again aggravated relations between local residents and refugees. In early October, they again gathered outside the center to protest. On October 9th, Turkish police reported the arrest of one of the suspects, 26-year-old Ali. It turned out that all this time he had been living in Istanbul. He was taken to the Netherlands, where a DNA sample was taken and the necessary tests conducted. It did not match the sample found on the victim's body, and the man was cleared of suspicion. The investigation has since stalled again, and at some point, the police and Marianne's family began to suspect her boyfriend again. Even though his DNA did not match the sample, Spencer's behavior seemed suspicious. The young woman's acquaintances and relatives were certain that Marianne would never ride her bike home at night because she was afraid of the dark, and the distance was not that short. Spencer should have sent her home by cab, which even Marianne's parents knew. Instead, he let her go alone on her bicycle. The young man was questioned several more times, and here began something strange. He changed his testimony about that evening several times. Originally, Spencer said that he had met Marianne at a cafe, after which they drove to the Butin Post. On re-examination, however, he stated that the young woman had gone there with friends before he even got to the cafe, so Spencer went to her on his bicycle. He went on to say that on the way there, he saw two guys walking with a bicycle. At one interrogation, Spencer said he did not recognize them because it was very dark outside. Then, he said they were two of his friends. This all seems strange, but the police had no evidence against Spencer, and his DNA did not match the killer's sample. The case stalled for several more months. On December 20th, the police decided to enlist the help of the public and asked all the men in the area to volunteer their DNA samples. But there was trouble waiting for them. It turned out that the law forbade the mass collection of DNA from citizens, even with their consent. So the authorities set a limit for the police. They could only take 150 samples, among which there was not a single match. From that point on, the case practically came to a standstill for several years. Marianne's parents tried to push for a change in the law that would have allowed extensive DNA screening, but they were turned down. The rationale was to protect people's privacy, even though such measures had already led to the capture of the perpetrator several times in other countries. In July 2001, the detectives announced an approximate profile of the perpetrator. They believed the killer was a local man between the ages of 20 and 40. The police again requested permission to conduct a large-scale collection of DNA samples within a 5-kilometer radius of the Marianne murder scene, but they were again denied. After that, the case finally came to a standstill. The victim's parents continued to participate in television shows and gave interviews, but each year, the case attracted less and less attention. There was no new evidence to help solve the gruesome mystery. In 2010, the police assembled a team that created a detailed 3D model of the crime scene and all available evidence using the latest computer technology. This again drew widespread public attention, and Marianne's parents again talked about the need for DNA screening. This time, 11 years after their daughter's murder, authorities decided to finally consider changing the law. The process took almost 2 years, and on September 6, 2012, the necessary amendments were passed. Police called a press conference to ask all men who were between 20 and 40 years old in 1999 to submit their DNA samples. The collection area was also limited to 5 kilometers. They estimated they were talking about 8,000 men, but not all of them agreed to give their DNA. The police managed to collect just over 6,500 samples, and experts began to study them. Unfortunately, the resources of the lab were limited. They had time to check about 400 samples a week, so the study had to take up to 4 months. The experts compared the samples to the killer's DNA profile, but they weren't just looking for a complete match. After all, it was unlikely the perpetrator would have given his DNA to the police. The lab was also trying to figure out the similarities by which they could establish kinship and trace back to the killer through a father, brother, or other relative. On November 19th, a month after the test began, experts finally got a long-awaited match. What was surprising was that they didn't just find a familial link, they got the DNA of the killer himself, meaning he voluntarily provided it to the police. Detectives soon announced the arrest of 45-year-old Jasper Syringa, a local farmer and father of 2. His house was only a few kilometers from where Marianne was killed. At first, the man kept silent, but after a conversation with his lawyer, he decided to confess. But the public only learned the details of this terrible crime on March 28, 2013, when the trial began. According to Jasper, that late evening, he was finishing up chores on his farm and decided to ride his bicycle before going to bed. As he himself admitted most of the time, riding his bicycle was just a cover for him. In fact, he was riding to a neighboring village to take advantage of the intimate services of local women. His wife was unaware of this, but in court he said that he had not intended to go there that night and had simply planned to ride to take his mind off family problems and difficulties on the farm. At one point, he noticed Marianne alone on an empty and dark road. Then it occurred to him that he could do whatever he wanted with her. Jasper drove up to her, took a penknife from his pocket, and threatened to silence her. He then took her to a field where he abused and killed her. At the trial, the man insisted that he did not mean to kill the young woman and did it out of panic. He realized what he had done and what the consequences would be for his entire family. His children were 5 and 8 years old at the time, and they were about to find out what their father had done. For this reason, Jasper decided to kill Marianne and go into hiding. But his conscience has been bothering him ever since. He continued to live in the area, listening to talk about the murder and seeing the family of his victim, whose lives would never be the same again because of his heinous act. Since then, he has repeated thoughts of turning himself into the police, but he's never made up his mind. When a massive DNA screening was announced in 2012, Jasper realized he would be figured out. He had so many relatives in the neighborhood, and one of them would certainly have turned in his DNA. Experts would find a partial match and start looking into all his relatives, which would inevitably lead to his capture. So Jasper decided to give his DNA. But he still couldn't bring himself to come to the police station and confess. The trial lasted only a few weeks, and on April 19th, the judge pronounced his sentence, 18 years in prison out of a possible 20 years under Dutch law. After 13 years, Marianne's relatives finally saw the perpetrator punished, but the judicial system gave them an unpleasant surprise. Due to his good behavior, Jasper is scheduled to be released as early as 2023, meaning he has spent less than 10 years behind bars. Mindy Schloss was born in 1955 in New York City. When she was 25, she moved to Alaska, where she graduated from a local medical university. The woman earned a degree in psychiatry and took a job as a nurse at Fairbanks Hospital, though most of the time she had to work on the field. Many people in remote areas of Alaska were not able to go to the hospital on their own, so Mindy and her colleagues would use all manner of transportation, including boats and airplanes, to get to them. She loved her job and took it as seriously as she could. Mindy lived about 600 kilometers from the hospital in Anchorage. She took a plane to work and stayed in a hotel all weekdays, going home on weekends. It was August 2007. Mindy, who was 52 years old at the time, returned to Anchorage for the weekend and was soon to fly back to work. During her absence, she always asked her best friend, Jerry, to stop by her house to feed her cat and give him the medicine he needed. On Saturday, August 4th, her friend called her to discuss the matter, but Mindy never came to the phone. She still hadn't been able to reach her all day, and it was strange. So Jerry contacted their mutual friend, but he too had not called Mindy that day. At first, Jerry thought Mindy had gone somewhere on business, but she didn't answer her phone the next day either. Then her friend decided to drive to her house. No one answered the door knock either, and Jerry used her spare key. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The house was in order, there were no signs of a struggle or any other evidence that something bad had happened to Mindy. It was only on the way out that Jerry noticed something strange. The doorknob of the front door was loose, and the woman decided to tighten the screws with a screwdriver. After that, she went to work without knowing where her friend had disappeared to. On Monday, August 6th, Jerry called the hospital where Mindy worked. To her surprise, the woman never showed up for work, which was completely out of character for her. Nor did she contact any of her coworkers to alert them of her absence. All this indicated that something might have happened to the woman, and Jerry decided to contact the police. The police department took a missing persons report, and Jerry and the detective went to Mindy's house again. No sign of a break-in was found. There was also nothing of value missing from the house. This ruled out the possibility that a burglar had broken into the woman's home. What's more, Mindy had some medications in her home that were only available with a doctor's prescription. Any burglar would most likely have taken them since they were in demand among people with drug addictions. Upon entering the garage, they discovered that Mindy's car was missing. It was also very strange. The woman always took a cab to the airport and only used her car to get around town. The police concluded that something really bad had happened to the woman. A forensic team examined the house, trying to find any clues, but it was inconclusive. At the time, the kidnapping theory was unlikely. The police thought Mindy might have probably had an accident. She often went to the countryside, and the terrain in those parts was quite dangerous. People could have fallen prey to wild animals or just accidentally fallen off a cliff. But this theory did not bring the police any closer to solving the case, and they decided to begin a search for suspects who, in theory, could have been involved in her disappearance. The first thing they did was check on Bob, Mindy and Jerry's mutual friend. The man was eager to cooperate with the investigation, and the detectives quickly determined that on the day of the woman's disappearance, he was at work, many miles away from her home. As to the exact time of Mindy's disappearance, the police had no clear answer. The woman had not been in touch since Saturday. After examining her computer, experts determined that the last time she used it was at 1:30 a.m. that same day. With no solid leads, police decided to enlist the help of the public. They posted flyers around town with information about the missing woman and distributed the information to local TV stations. The same day, they began receiving calls from witnesses, but most of the leads led nowhere. People reported seeing Mindy in various places and even in other states. None of these leads were ever helpful. Meanwhile, Bob and his coworkers decided to comb the area where Mindy might have gone. She had been out in the countryside quite often for berries or just out for a walk. Unfortunately, the search also yielded no results. The detectives decided to go a different route and contacted the bank the woman used. They asked them to check to see if there had been any activity on her cards in recent days, and this is where a serious lead finally awaited them. Early Sunday morning, the day after Mindy went missing, someone had withdrawn $500 from her debit card, the maximum amount available for withdrawing in a 24-hour period. Police immediately obtained the ATM camera footage from the bank, and they got a disturbing sighting. It turned out that the money had been withdrawn by an unknown man. His face was covered by a bandana, so they could not identify him. He pulled down the bandana only after his face was out of the camera's field of view. As a result, the police had no choice but to wait until the man tried to use someone else's card again. Meanwhile, the detectives received another tip. They learned from Mindy's coworkers that the woman was planning to renovate her home and had hired workers. At some point, she had a conflict with their supervisor over the cost of the work. Mindy later admitted to her coworkers that she was afraid of him because he acted strangely during visits to her home. The police checked on the man, but he turned out to have an alibi for the day the woman disappeared. They also questioned another worker who came to her house on Friday around 7 p.m. The man was also uninvolved, and he couldn't remember anything suspicious that night. It wasn't long before detectives had a new lead. Bank security reported that Mindy's card had been charged $500 again in the early morning hours, but this time from a different ATM. After studying the security footage, the police immediately realized it was the same man as the first time. But there was something odd on the tape. The man withdrew the money and left, but returned to the ATM a few seconds later. He walked around it for a while, pushing buttons, and eventually left again. After calling the bank, detectives found out the reason for his strange behavior. The unknown person forgot to take the card out, and the ATM then takes it away to prevent the theft. The real owner can get it back by going to the bank with his ID. Of course, this was not an option for the criminal, so he lost access to Mindy's account forever. This time, the police managed to find a witness. He drove up to the very same ATM when an unidentified man came out of there. According to the witness, he got on his bicycle and rode away. It was a significant lead since most people were traveling by car or on foot. But all that information was still not enough to get any closer to a clue, and detectives decided to interview everyone in the Mindy area. They asked people to recall any oddity or to point them to neighbors who were suspicious. To their surprise, many residents named one particular house right near Mindy's house. According to them, parties were constantly held there. The residents were always making noise and disturbing the peace. The detectives went there and found out that quite a number of people were living there. But they weren't willing to talk to the police. The detectives then went to a woman who lived directly across the street from the house. She said she did not see anything suspicious, but her demeanor showed that she was very nervous. The next day, the woman called the police station and asked the detectives to meet, but not at her house. They met at another location, and the woman shared a creepy story. Shortly before the detectives' first visit, a man who lived across the street had stopped by to see her. He said police were walking around the neighborhood and asked the woman not to tell them he lived here. When asked why, he said he was on parole and did not want the police to know his location. At night, the woman heard someone walking on the porch of her house. She looked out the window and saw that it was the same man. He stomped around, looked in several windows, and left. The woman was greatly frightened and decided to tell the police about it. Detectives learned his name was Josh Wade, who was 27 years old at the time. After running him through the database, they found out that the guy had been convicted of murder 7 years earlier. At the time, he was accused of beating a woman to death, but a jury acquitted him. As a result, Josh was accused of tampering with evidence and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. After spending 3 years behind bars, he was released early. Detectives immediately identified him as a prime suspect. After talking to his housemates, they found out that Josh didn't have a car and that he got around mainly by bicycle. But there was just one problem. When police began looking for him, the man had disappeared without a trace. On Thursday, August 9th, police suddenly had another lead. A local trucker called them and said he had spotted Mindy's car in a parking lot near the airport. He had seen its picture in the newspapers and immediately recognized the car. Detectives arrived on the scene and confirmed that the car was indeed Mindy's. They also noticed that a surveillance camera was pointed at the parking lot from a nearby building and requested a recording. It showed a man driving this car into the parking lot at 12:30 p.m. on August 4th. Getting out and wiping down the door handle, apparently he was wiping off his fingerprints. Unfortunately, the quality of the recording did not allow his face to be seen. CSI examined the car for prints or traces of DNA and were able to recover some samples. However, it took time to study them, and there was no guarantee they would be useful in the case. On the passenger seat was Mindy's purse, which could indicate that the woman had been in the car with the perpetrator, alive or dead. Not getting the results they wanted from using modern analysis tools, the detectives decided to use search dogs. Few believed this idea would succeed since it had been a week since Mindy had disappeared, but for lack of other options, they still turned to film dogs. The service dog was taken to the ATMs from which the unknown man had withdrawn money, as well as Mindy's car. The dog picked up the trail and headed down the street toward the woman's house, located 3 blocks from that location. After sniffing the front door, she went straight to the very house where Josh Wayne had previously lived. The detectives, who until recently had not believed in the search dog idea, were shocked. The service dog directly pointed them to the fact that Josh was in Mindy's car, near her house and near those ATMs. The next day, the police repeated the experiment with another search dog. The result was the same. The dogs walked the entire distance and stopped at Josh's house. Though it was not an unqualified piece of evidence that would work in court, the detectives decided not to waste their time and obtained a warrant for the suspect's arrest. They went to his house, but the man hadn't been there in days. After searching the building, they found the same jacket that the unidentified man had been wearing on the cameras near the ATMs, and in the pocket was a cash withdrawal slip from Mindy's card. Next, they discovered a woman's gold watch and immediately showed it to Jerry. The woman confirmed that the watch belonged to Mindy. The experts were able to compare the DNA samples found on the steering wheel of Mindy's car with samples from items from his home, and they matched. This indicated that Josh had been in the missing woman's car. This evidence was already much more serious, and the police were focused on catching the suspect. Leaflets with his name were posted all over the city, and they even rented several billboards. According to detectives, it was one of the largest manhunt operations in Alaskan history. Virtually every law enforcement officer was working on the matter, and locals reported any suspicious evidence. At one point, police released ATM camera photos and were approached almost immediately by a woman named Lisa. She said she had met Josh before and was sure he was the one in the photo. The important thing here is that the police did not name the main suspect, but what followed was the turning point in the case. Another acquaintance of Josh's came to the police with a confession. For the past week, she had been helping him get around town by transporting him in her car. One day, he left his backpack in the back seat, and the young woman and her mother looked inside. There they found several more ATM receipts, as well as a phone. In the gallery, they found a photo in which Josh was supposedly holding a gun in his hand. For the police, this information only added to the alarm. Detectives already feared that the suspect might attack someone else while they were looking for him, and thanks to his phone, they found out that he was also armed. The cops tried to convince his girlfriend to help them catch Josh. They wanted the young woman to take a tape recorder with her and go to meet him, where they would try to get him to talk about what he had done to Mindy. But the young woman was too scared and refused. Soon, however, she had to participate against her own will. On September 2nd, Josh came to her house and, in an aggressive manner, began demanding her backpack. Given that the young woman gave it to the police, she had to come up with an excuse on the fly. Realizing she didn't have the backpack, Josh asked her to take him somewhere, far away from here to hide from the police. But the young woman refused. Instead, she offered to let him stay at her house, but Josh suspected something was wrong and left. The young woman realized that she would not be safe until the police caught the man, so she decided to follow him discreetly in her car, calling the detectives along the way. At some point, Josh reached his acquaintance's house and went inside. By that time, the police, SWAT, and FBI had already begun to converge on the scene. Everyone feared that the suspect would not surrender without a fight, and those fears proved to be true. Using weapons, Josh took 2 people who were in the house with him hostage. A lawyer was invited to negotiate with him, who, after several hours, managed to convince him to surrender. During the interrogation, he hardly spoke to the police, but the investigators were in no hurry to accuse him of killing Mindy. At that point, They already thought the woman was probably dead, but without her body, it would have been extremely difficult to prove it. So Josh was only charged with stealing Mindy's bank card and watch. The FBI agent decided to get crafty. He listed the charges to Josh and he said they were all lies. The investigator then stated that they had evidence that he was the one who withdrew the money from someone else's card, and Mindy herself had gone to the police to report the card theft. Upon hearing this, the suspect grinned and asked what games they were trying to play with him. From this reaction, the FBI agent was finally convinced that Josh had killed Mindy, but the police still had to find her body in order to charge Josh with murder. They had to work against the weather. It was snowing early in that area, and they would have no chance of finding Mindy if her remains got snowed in. On September 13th, police received a call from an electrician working near the town of Wasilla, about 100 miles from Anchorage. He spotted the body of a woman in a wooded area and immediately thought it was Mindy, and experts from the lab confirmed it. The deceased was indeed Mindy Schloss. The medical examination revealed that the woman had been shot in the back of the head, and her remains had been disposed of by fire. After the bullet was recovered, it was determined that it had been fired from the very weapon with which Josh had been apprehended. All the police had to do now was to figure out how the events that led to Minnie's death unfolded. Meanwhile, the experts continued to examine every millimeter of her house, trying to find any trace of Josh's presence. It was extremely difficult to do so. They had to collect virtually every hair from the floor of Mindy's house and then examine it in the lab. It took months, but eventually they were able to find a hair that belonged to Josh. This was confirmed by DNA testing, and the detectives now had proof in hand of the suspect's presence in the victim's home. On May 18, 2008, 10 months after the murder, he was finally charged and brought to trial. While gathering witnesses to testify against Josh, an interesting situation occurred. His ex-girlfriend, Lisa, who had identified him from a photo near an ATM, refused to testify in court. She regularly visited her ex-boyfriend in prison, and at one point, the couple announced their intention to marry. Investigators were shocked by this turn of events, but they quickly realized what was behind the move. The U.S. Constitution allows relatives not to testify against each other, and in all likelihood, Josh convinced Lisa to marry him for these reasons. There was one problem, though. Soon after the marriage was consummated, it was declared null and void because state law prohibited weddings with inmates. But the detectives wondered why Josh was so intent on shielding Lisa from questioning and testifying. Was it really all about some pictures outside an ATM where you couldn't even see his face? Most likely, the young woman knew a lot more. Investigators tried to get her to talk, but at first they did not succeed. However, at some point, Lisa herself contacted them and said that Josh confessed to her about the murder during one of her visits to the prison. According to his story, there was a party at his house Friday night. Josh, who had no means of livelihood, decided to sneak into the house next door and steal something. That house turned out to be Mindy's place. Josh opened the door of the house and began to search the house for valuables. At one point, Mindy walked into the room, and he immediately realized that if he let her live now, he wouldn't be able to avoid jail. He didn't want to go there again, so he grabbed the woman, took her to the bathroom, and tied her hands. The perpetrator then went to his house to get a gun, taking some handy things to kidnap her with. Before returning to Mindy's house, he put bags of her legs and secured them with duct tape so as not to leave any trace. He then took the woman to the garage, put her in his own car, and drove out of town. After an hour of driving, he stopped in a wooded area and drove Mindy away from the road, where he killed her. Josh then returned to her house, cleaned, vacuumed the carpet, and left. The trial did not begin until the spring of 2009. The prosecution had offered Josh a deal. He would confess to killing Mindy and another woman 7 years earlier in exchange for waiving the death penalty. This way, the authorities hoped to close two high-profile cases at once, and Josh agreed. As a result, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison without parole. During the reading of the sentence, Josh cried, but at one point things heated up when the judge called him a coward for taking the lives of two women. The criminal jumped up and shouted, "What about the men I killed?" At this point, his lawyers grabbed him and silenced him before he could say anything else. That shouting kept the detectives busy for 5 long years until, in 2014, Josh himself offered authorities a new deal. He agreed to confess to the murders of 3 men if he was transferred from a local prison to a federal prison. Apparently, the conditions there were much higher. Considering that the criminal's request was insignificant, the authorities agreed. Josh said he killed one man in Anchorage in 1994 when he was only 14 years old. He committed the next murder in 1999, and he killed the third man a year later, the same day he massacred the woman. The first 2 men have been identified, but the identity of the third is still a mystery. Investigators have no doubt that Josh was indeed involved in the murders. They are more concerned about another question: whether there are no other crimes under his belt, about which he is silent. In any case, the police have managed to permanently isolate him from society and prevent other murders that would surely have followed. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like it if you liked the video. Thanks for watching. Haley Dodd was born on November 30th, 1981 in England. When the girl was young, her parents, along with other children, moved to Australia, settling in the small town of Mandurah. The young woman was an excellent student, played sports, and planned to go to study to be a veterinarian or a school teacher. But before finally deciding on a choice of future profession, she wanted to travel around Australia. Graduating high school in 1999, at the age of 17, she set off on a trip to Western Australia with her best friend, Lisa. Their plan wasn't just to drive through local towns and attractions, but to spend a few months away from home. The young women were going to look for temporary jobs along the way to cover their living, food, and travel expenses. They planned to hitchhike between cities, which in the 1990s in Australia didn't sound like such a dangerous idea. At the time, there had been a number of murders of young women hitchhiking in the country, but compared to the overall number of people hitchhiking safely, these crimes did not cause any mass fear. However, Haley feared that her parents would not allow her to travel that way, even in the company of a friend. For this reason, she assured them that she planned to travel by bus. At the end of July, she and Lisa traveled to a town called Dungara. There, they were going to work as day laborers on a local farm. They were staying at a camping site where they could get a place to sleep for a small fee. Such places are in high demand in Australia, mainly because of their cheapness. A few days before going to work, Haley decided to use the remaining free time and go to a farm to family friends, which was 200 kilometers away. She decided to hitchhike to it, and Lisa didn't want to let her go alone. But Haley insisted she had nothing to worry about and would be back in a few days. To say goodbye, Lisa gave her her folding knife for self-defense and some change so Haley could call her from the phone booth. After saying goodbye, she hit the road at about 8 a.m. Family friends at the farm awaited her arrival, but Haley never showed up. Worried, they called her mother and informed her. The woman feared something might have happened to her daughter, so she immediately called the police. The first thing she did was to dial an emergency number and describe the situation. After listening to her story, the operator thought that nothing urgent had happened, so she advised her to go to the local police department and file a missing person report. So she did. The detectives began their search for Haley, beginning to reconstruct the chronology of events. The first thing they did was arrive at the campsite where Lisa was staying. She was mortified at the news that her friend had never made it to the farm, but the young woman was able to give the police a comprehensive introduction. She accurately described all the clothes Haley was wearing that day and even drew a sketch of the earrings she was wearing for the police. Haley had bought these earrings a few days before the incident. She and Lisa had gone to the store to treat themselves to some inexpensive items, and the young woman was attracted to this jewelry. At that time, she couldn't have imagined that those earrings would be the key to solving this terrible mystery of her disappearance. Detectives disseminated information about the missing young woman along with her description. Although she was almost 18 years old, Haley looked much younger. She was 152 centimeters tall and weighed just over 40 pounds. The police were able to locate the first witness fairly quickly. It turned out to be the truck driver who had given her a ride that day. According to the man's story, she had knocked on his cab window at a gas station and asked for a ride to Mora, a town near where there was a farm. The trucker was on his way to another town, but he agreed to give her a ride most of the way. The man dropped her off at a turnoff about 50 kilometers from Mora, near the town of Vajangera, where she was to turn off the main road and onto a country road. According to the trucker, Haley was in high spirits, chatting with him the whole way and talking about her journey. After she said she was almost out of money, he gave her $15 so the young woman could buy something to eat. The man also left her his number in case she hitchhiked back. He made trips down that road almost every day and could have let her down again. Later, detectives received several more calls from people who had seen Haley in that area. Based on their statements, police concluded that the young woman had been on foot along the northwest road towards Mora. Apparently, she could not find any driver at the gas station to give her a ride. For this reason, she decided to walk along the road and try to hitch a ride. Based on the testimony of the next witness, he gave Haley a ride to the turnoff on Goonderdo Road, after which she headed further in her direction on foot. The next witness was a woman driving along the road. She spotted Haley just as the young woman was getting out of her car and moving on foot towards Mora. In all, the police were contacted by more than 10 witnesses. After putting their statements together, detectives concluded that the young woman was last seen at about 12 noon on the northwest road, about 50 kilometers from Mora. There was another witness, though. He had not seen Haley, but still shared a disturbing observation with police. The man pulled over on the side of the northwest road because his engine was overheating. At one point, he heard a dog barking, followed by a piercing female scream. He couldn't see the source of the sound, as it might have been far enough away. The road passed through an empty flat area where there was virtually no extraneous noise. With all this information in hand, the police's prognosis was disappointing from the start. Lead Detective Eddie Rowe decided that they should look for the body and not consider the possibility that Haley might be alive. But management forbade him to investigate in such a manner, leaving it to the status of the search for the missing person. It's worth clarifying here that a murder investigation would have given the police more options than a missing person investigation, but the police had no leads that could help them get on the young woman's trail, so they quickly set about looking for potential kidnappers. In a short time, they were able to identify several dozen suspects who lived in the area, but eventually the police focused on 3 men. One worked as a teacher at a local school, another was a part-time gardener there, and the third lived not far from where Haley disappeared. When questioned, each of them pleaded not guilty and provided alibis. The police could not conclude with certainty of their innocence, but they could not find any evidence to the contrary. But soon the situation changed dramatically. The investigators were approached by a neighbor of one of the suspects, a 43-year-old school gardener named Francis Wark. He told them that the day Haley disappeared, Francis borrowed his car to go shopping in Mora. When the man returned home around 1 p.m., a neighbor noticed damage inside the car. The turn signal knob was broken, and the dashboard also showed signs of impact. The neighbor didn't even have time to ask what happened to the car. Francis came home, dumped the shopping bags in the kitchen, got on his motorcycle, and drove off. This story seemed strange to the police, and they decided to re-interview Francis. The man said that at the time of Haley's disappearance, he was many kilometers away from the alleged place of her abduction. According to his story, after returning home, he immediately went to a party in the city of Perth on his motorcycle. But he was not supposed to get there that day. On the way there, he exceeded the speed limit and had a serious accident that took him to the hospital. The information available was enough for the detectives to ask the perfectly logical question: where was he going in such a hurry? His own testimony seemed very strange, and investigators decided to apply for a search warrant of his home. The officers searched his residence, but they were unable to find any potential evidence. They also searched the car and removed the seat covers so that experts could examine them in the lab. Unfortunately, none of this yielded any results, and Francis was left alone. Almost immediately after that, he moved to the other side of the country, to Queensland, and the detectives were left empty-handed, and the case went into a long drawer. They tried to find new witnesses and evidence to move the investigation forward, but to no avail. This went on for 8 whole years until Francis came back on the police radar in 2007. At the time, he was living in a remote outback in a small settlement. One morning, an elderly couple who lived next door to him were sitting on the porch of their house. At some point, they noticed with horror that a young woman with absolutely no clothes was running in their direction, and her head was covered with blood. She asked for help, and the residents of the house called the police. The victim said that she had tried to catch a ride the night before. A man stopped in front of her and offered her a ride. At one point, he told her he needed to go to a place to get gas and fill up his car. They drove up to a house in the middle of nowhere, and he called the woman inside and offered her some tea. Unfortunately for her, she said yes. Almost immediately thereafter, he attacked her, and after a brief struggle, tied her up. For the next few hours, the victim was subject to indescribable torture and violence. Her assailant also tore off one of her earrings and took it for himself. As you may have guessed, this man was Francis. By morning, the woman realized that she could get the rope off her hands and then free her legs and run. She loosened the rope, waited for the right moment for Francis to move as far away as possible, and rushed to the back door of the house. Before she left, she removed her pendant and tossed it under the bed. The woman feared that the police might not find any corroboration of her story, so she decided to leave some personal item in his house, and it really worked. The police searched Francis's house, found the very same pendant, and arrested the man. At the trial, he quickly realized that he could not get away with it and decided to confess to what he had done. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The police in Western Australia, who handled the Haley Dodd case, were notified of Francis's arrest, but they did not appear to be at all interested. No action was taken by the detectives to revive the 8-year-old case, which was so closely resembling the circumstances of Francis's crime. Only through the insistence of Haley's mother did the detectives agree to reopen the case, but they quickly concluded that there was still no evidence against Francis, which meant there was nothing they could do about it. All these years, Haley's family tried to get the police to investigate thoroughly, but they assured them that they had done everything in their power. Desperate to wait for help from law enforcement, the relatives spent tens of thousands of dollars on private investigators, but all to no avail. The case did not take a new turn until 6 long years later, in 2013, when an extremely outrageous fact came to light. It turned out that the police had simply forgotten about the evidence that ended up being the key to the case. The medical examiner, Tracy Horn, filed a request to reopen the investigation. The reason was that the very same car seat covers seized from Frances's neighbor's car in 1999 were found in evidence storage. Suddenly, it turned out that for 14 years, they had never been tested for blood, DNA, and other evidence. When experts did retrieve them, they were immediately able to find a woman's earring that had snagged on the fabric of the covers. Taking a drawing of Lisa's, which she drew for the police just after her friend's disappearance, detectives were horrified to see. It was the same earring that Haley was wearing the morning of her disappearance. But that wasn't all. A human hair was found on one of the car mats that had also been removed from the car. Experts extracted a DNA sample from it that showed a match to Haley Dodd's mother's DNA. That meant that the hair was very likely Haley's own, but that probability was not 100%, which made it very difficult to prosecute Frances in the shortest possible time. As soon as the news leaked to the media, a wave of criticism poured in against the police. For 14 years, this evidence lay literally under the noses of the investigators, but in all that time, they never remembered it. Of course, such a find instantly changed the course of the case, and the detectives went to the other side of the country to interrogate Frances again. At the time, he was still in prison for assaulting a woman in 2007. The man gave them the same story he had told them 14 years earlier. He denied his involvement and assured them that he was shopping in Mora at the time of Haley's abduction. The interrogation, which lasted nearly 4 hours, was inconclusive, so the police had to prepare the case to go to trial. It wasn't until 2015 when he was formally charged with Haley's murder and deported to Western Australia. 2 more years later, in late 2017, the trial began. Frances's defense insisted that all the evidence presented was circumstantial. The earring Haley bought at a local store was very cheap and popular, so it could have been left in the car by another woman. The hair found in the car showed an almost 100% match to Haley's DNA, but not an absolute exact match. Although a mistake here would have been highly unlikely, that was enough for the lawyers. But all these arguments seemed unconvincing to the judge. Perhaps Frances would still have had a chance to get away with it if not for his crime in 2007. But then he didn't just kidnap a woman who was hitchhiking, he also took her earring. The prosecution believed that the man was collecting the victim's earrings as trophies, which only increased the suspicion against him in the end. As a result, the judge found him guilty of kidnapping and murdering Haley Dodd, sentencing him to 21 years in prison. All of this took place while his previous sentence was still pending. Frances was 62 years old at the time of his sentencing, but the story did not end there. The court believed Frances kidnapped and killed Haley, then hid her body, but it was never found, and the man himself refused to plead guilty. Haley's mother repeatedly asked the killer to tell her where he hid the body, but to no avail. And in 2018, she helped pass a new law that says murderers are not eligible for parole if they refuse to reveal the location of their victims' bodies. In 2020, another high-profile event occurred. The court granted Frances appeal to overturn his sentence and scheduled a new hearing. His lawyers again tried to insist that the man would not have had time to kidnap Haley between his trip to Mora and his return home, but the court felt that the time frame allowed him well enough to do so, especially given the rush with which he arrived home and immediately set off for Perth on his motorcycle. Moreover, the earring, along with the hair, were still on the list of key evidence against him, but Frances still managed to get his sentence changed. The court found him guilty of involuntary manslaughter, reducing his sentence from 21 years to 18 years. But thanks to a law passed in 2018, he would not be able to go free even after that time if he refused to identify the location of the body. There is another point in the whole story that keeps the detectives busy to this day. They are sure that many more women have become victims of Frances and that none of them managed to escape. This maniac could have been picking up young women on the roads for decades, and what happened to them next, only he knows. One of the most likely similar cases is the disappearance of a woman in late 2005. She hitchhiked to another city and was never seen again. The detective handling the case is certain that Francis kidnapped her because he knew the victim personally, but there is no evidence at this time. Perhaps the police will find it again in their warehouse a few years later, but it won't make a difference to the perpetrator. If the police had examined the car more thoroughly, Francis would have been arrested back in 1999. Now we can only guess how many lives he ruined in the ensuing years, but sooner or later, the mystery may be solved. There's another creepy thing about this whole story. Remember that in the initial stages of the investigation, the police identified 3 main suspects, including Francis? Now, one of them killed his wife 5 months after Haley disappeared, and the other, who worked as a school teacher, turned out to be one of the worst child molesters in Australian history. Too bad the police had no way to solve them at the time. Linda Slatton was born in 1950 in the state of Alabama, USA. She had loving parents and a younger sister named Judy. From an early age, Linda was ambitious and kind-hearted. She always tried to help others, which earned her many friends. Later, she married a man named Frank, with whom she had 2 sons, Jeff and Tim. However, as the years went by, their marriage became increasingly problematic. Frank developed an alcohol addiction and started to abuse his wife and children. Eventually, Linda left and decided to move to Florida with her sons. They settled in the city of Lakeland, where Linda's parents and sister already lived. Linda rented a house in a residential complex by the lake and dedicated all her time to providing for her sons. Linda took various jobs, but money was always tight for her. Sometimes she had to sell her belongings to pay the bills. She couldn't even afford a car, so her elder son, Jeff, had to ride his bicycle to school. Her younger son, Tim, played on a football team, and often he had to ask his coach for a ride home after practice to avoid walking. Despite the financial difficulties, Linda always strived to give her sons the most time and attention she could. She took them on hikes, brought them to concerts of their favorite bands, and overall tried to ensure their childhood was filled with positive moments. On the evening of September 3, 1981, when Linda was 31 years old, she waited for Tim to finish his practice and went with him to the neighbors who were hosting a small family gathering. Meanwhile, Jeff arrived home and wanted to have dinner, but there was hardly any food in the fridge. He got angry at his mother, hopped on his bicycle, and rode to his grandparents' house, who lived on the other side of the city. Later, when the whole family returned home, Jeff argued with his mother about the empty fridge, but eventually they wished each other a good night and went to bed. The next morning, Linda's sister, who lived in the same complex, went to her house to invite her for a cup of coffee. She knocked on the door but received no response. Thinking that Linda had gone somewhere, the woman turned around and was about to leave when she noticed that the bedroom window was open. She approached it, looked inside, and saw Linda lying across the bed. In the next second, the woman screamed and ran to the neighbors to call the police. One look at her sister's face was enough for her to realize that she was dead. Detectives arrived at their house and began examining the crime scene. Linda was lying on her bed, her clothing partially pulled down with a wire hanger around her neck. Based on this evidence, the police suspected that an unknown man had entered the victim's room, assaulted her, and strangled her. Soon, forensic experts confirmed this theory by finding a palm print on the windowsill. Linda often left it open since there was no air conditioning in the apartment, making it easy for the killer to gain access. While the detectives worked at the crime scene, the eldest son of the victim woke up from all the commotion. The investigators took him outside and delivered the tragic news of his mother's death. Afterward, they woke up his younger brother and led him towards the exit. However, at that very moment, as the boy passed by his mother's room, another police officer emerged from it, and through the open door, Tim saw his mother's body and froze in place until the officer pulled him away. Jeff and Tim, aged 15 and 12 at the time, were in deep shock. Initially, they simply couldn't believe that their mother was dead. Later, the investigators managed to talk to them, and the brothers stated that they hadn't heard any noise and hadn't even woken up that night. Despite having their own rooms, the detectives found this strange. Considering the building had very good acoustics, and given the brutal nature of the murder, loud noises should have been audible from the victim's room. The police interviewed the neighbors, who also hadn't heard anything. None of the residents in the complex had seen any suspicious individuals that day. Medical experts examined the victim's body and confirmed that she had been subjected to violence. They extracted the killer's biological material, but at that time, they couldn't conduct DNA analysis. The experts also confirmed that Linda died as a result of strangulation. Thus, the detectives had to investigate the case with almost no evidence. The palm print could only help them if they managed to find a suspect and make a comparison. Linda's sons moved in with their grandparents. They remained in a state of shock and constantly feared that the unknown killer would come after them. The fear was so intense that they slept in the same room as their grandmother, while their grandfather sat in the living room with a rifle. However, the detectives believed that the children were not in danger. In their opinion, the crime had solely a sexual motive and the killer must have known the victim. After speaking with Linda's relatives, they learned about her ex-husband, who had a history of domestic violence. He immediately became the prime suspect, but the police quickly determined that the man was in a different state at the time of the murder. Afterward, the investigators discovered that shortly before her death, Linda had started dating a certain man. They located this person, but he also had a solid alibi. The detectives checked all the victim's neighbors, comparing their fingerprints with the sample found on the windowsill. They then conducted a similar comparison with all previously convicted men residing in Lakeland, but they couldn't find any matches. Several weeks after the murder, Linda's sons gradually started to recover, and eventually, the relatives decided that the best option for them would be to return to school. Over time, it did help the brothers as they began interacting with friends again and gradually returned to a normal life. Tim rejoined the football team as his mother had always been proud of his accomplishments in the sport. A month after her death, he hung a photograph of his team in his bedroom as a reminder of how his mother had taught him to move forward and achieve his goals. Meanwhile, the detectives reached a dead end, failing to find a suitable suspect. They decided to go back to the beginning and reconsider why the sons hadn't heard any screams or signs of a struggle. The police reviewed Jeff's statements and noticed that he had an argument with Linda on the day of her murder. Furthermore, the teenager himself mentioned that he and his mother frequently engaged in verbal disputes. This made the detectives ponder. Could Jeff have killed his mother? They called him in for questioning and started asking various questions again. Soon, Jeff realized that the investigators suspected him of the crime. He denied his involvement, but the detectives continued to pressure him. They offered Jeff to undergo a polygraph test, and he agreed. The polygraph operator did not detect any signs of deception, but the police were not ready to give up. Soon after, they called him in for questioning again and even planned to bring in a hypnotist to put him in a trance state. Jeff constantly faced pressure, and one of the investigators directly accused him of strangling his mother. This led to the breaking point for Linda's relatives, and they demanded that the police focus on finding the real killer and prohibited them from approaching Jeff. Despite this, Jeff agreed to undergo another polygraph test, and after successful results, he was finally no longer considered a suspect. From that point on, the case remained stagnant for many years. Jeff and Tim grew up, got jobs, and started their own families. The murder of their mother still haunted them, but every time they contacted the investigators, they received the same response. No progress had been made in the case. In March 1999, experts extracted a DNA sample from the biological material found on the victim's body. 2 years later, a new detective assigned to the case compared it with samples from all the suspects, including Linda's 2 sons, but there were no matches. Even comparing it with the FBI database yielded no results. When Jeff met with this detective, he realized that they had been acquainted for many years. It turned out that the men regularly played bowling together with mutual friends. They talked, and the investigator promised Jeff that he would solve the case, no matter what. Around the same time, Tim and Jeff heard about another unsolved crime that had remained unresolved for many years. After it received widespread media attention, new evidence emerged, leading to the capture of the perpetrator. That's when the brothers decided to approach journalists and share their family tragedy. They gave a detailed interview, and the story made it into the local newspapers. In September 2001, the detective received an interesting lead. He learned that a man named Jimmy Ulmer had abducted a young woman through her bedroom window a year after Linda's murder, for which he received an 80-year prison sentence. What made it even more intriguing was that during Linda's murder, this person lived in the same residential complex just a few meters away from her house. At the time of Ulmer's arrest, the DNA of criminals was not yet entered into a common database since it simply did not exist. The man himself passed away in '96, and there were no remaining biological samples. However, the detective contacted the perpetrator's mother, who provided several personal belongings from which the experts managed to extract a sample. Unfortunately, it did not match the DNA of the killer. But despite the setback, the detective was not ready to give up. He continued to search for new suspects, consistently asked the FBI to run the DNA sample of the killer through all available databases, and stayed in touch with Linda's sons. Unfortunately, in 2015, he encountered health problems that forced him to retire, despite his promise to see the case through to the end. At that point, Jeff and Tim had almost resigned themselves to the thought that they would never find their mother's killer. However, in 2019, a new hope emerged when C.C. Moore, a renowned expert in genetic genealogy, took on the case. She took the DNA sample of the killer and uploaded it to public databases, then began searching for any matches. Typically, such databases can even help find the most distant relatives of the DNA owner, who could be living in different parts of the world without the slightest knowledge of each other's existence. With this information, it is possible to trace their family tree, find common lines, filter out thousands of relatives, and identify the DNA owner. After conducting all this extensive work, Moore was able to pinpoint one family living in the area at the time of the murder. Within that family, there was only one person who fit all the parameters, leading her to conclude that he was highly likely to be the killer. When the detectives heard his name, they immediately realized they had come across him in old reports. His name was Joseph Clinton Mills, Tim's football coach, who regularly gave him a ride home from practice. He had never been on the list of suspects, but back in 1981, the police had taken his statement over the phone as he had dropped Tim off at home on that same day. None of the detectives even considered the possibility that Mills could be the killer. At that time, he was only 20 years old, and there was absolutely no evidence against him. So the police didn't compare his DNA and fingerprints with the samples found at the crime scene. The investigators decided to hold off on informing Jeff and Tim about this discovery. First, they needed to make sure that Mills was truly behind their mother's murder. After studying his biography, they found out that in 1984, Mills was arrested for forgery of a will, and his fingerprints were taken, which are still kept in a paper archive to this day. Experts compared them with the fingerprints found on the victim's windowsill and obtained a perfect match. After 38 years, they finally learned the identity of the probable killer. Immediately after this revelation, the detectives moved on to the final step, obtaining a DNA sample from Mills to compare it with the biological material from the victim's body. They discovered that the man still lived in the same house as in 1981. Mills was now 58 years old, owned a small business, was married, and had children and grandchildren. The detectives monitored him for several weeks, hoping to obtain some item with his DNA. It could have been a cigarette butt, a coffee cup, a bottle, and so on. However, they never had the opportunity, so the police decided to discreetly retrieve his trash. They handed the bag to the laboratory, where experts tried to find an item with his DNA, and soon they succeeded. The results were not long in coming. Mills' DNA matched completely with the sample found on Linda's body. Afterward, the detectives met with her sons to inform them of the progress in the case. They were both shocked, but Tim had a much harder time accepting it. He couldn't believe that his football coach turned out to be the same monster who had killed his mother. Tim respected him and looked up to him, and what's more, Mills continued to give him rides home from practice even after the murder. The man constantly encouraged him and always asked if there were any developments in his mother's case. For all these years, a photo of his football team hung in Tim's old bedroom with the monster who killed his mom standing right behind him. In the same year Mills was arrested, he remained calm and didn't even ask what he was being accused of. When brought in for questioning and asked about Linda's murder, he claimed to have no involvement. According to him, he dropped off Tim and left. Mills insisted that he never entered their house, but the detectives knew it was a lie. They informed him about the DNA and fingerprint match, after which the suspect suddenly changed his version of events. Now, Mills insisted that on that night, Linda herself invited him to sneak into her bedroom through the window for an intimate encounter. Then she asked him to lightly choke her with a hanger, but Mills miscalculated his strength and ended up killing her. Of course, the detectives didn't believe this story for a second, considering all the existing evidence. They had a much more plausible theory. Based on the fact that Mills had repeatedly given Tim rides home, he had seen his mother and could have targeted her as a victim. On the evening of the murder, he dropped off the boy, who immediately went to a party at the neighbor's house with his mother. Mills took advantage of the fact that no one would be home in their house. He drove away for some distance and then returned on foot, sneaking into Linda's bedroom through the window and hiding in the closet. He spent several hours there, waiting for everyone to go to sleep. In that same closet, he took a wire hanger and used it as a murder weapon. After subjecting the victim to violence, he left the house through the window. Based on all the available evidence, charges were brought against Mills for the murder, and the case was handed over to court. In the state of Florida, the death penalty was a possible sentence for such a crime. And on February 9, 2022, Mills decided to make a deal with the prosecution to avoid this fate. He confessed to the murder, but under the conditions of the agreement, he was not required to disclose the details of the crime. Linda's sons were unhappy with this fact. In the courtroom, Tim shouted at his coach, demanding to know why he took his mother away from him. But the man remained silent, looking down. Only when given the opportunity for a final statement, Mills said, "I'm a good person. I'm not who they're trying to portray me as." This angered the brothers even more, but ultimately, they were grateful to the investigators for bringing the case to a conclusion and finally finding the killer. Mills was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the verdict was delivered, Jeff and Tim promised to try to live honorable lives and dedicate themselves to their families, as that is what their mother would have wanted. Rachel Jane Nichol was born on November 23, 1968, in a village near Colchester, England. She grew up in a decent, full family. Her father was an army officer and her mother a housewife. From an early age, the young woman took part in various volunteer programs, helping the elderly and children with disabilities. At age 11, she enrolled at Colchester High School for Girls, where she was active in dance, singing, and acting. All of her teachers insisted that the young woman had real talent and should develop in that direction. However, Rachel herself was more deeply into the study of history and English. After school, she got a job as a lifeguard at the pool in Richmond. Rachel later planned to try her hand at hosting a television program for children. In 1988, when she was 20 years old, Rachel met her future husband, Andre. The couple began dating, and a year later, they had a son, Alex. Together, they moved to an area of London called Thelham. By then, she had already been offered a job as a model, but she decided to devote her full attention to her family for a few years and then try to get a job in television. On a summer morning, July 15, 1992, Rachel took her son and their Labrador for a walk in the local park. At the time, Alex was only a month away from his 3rd birthday. This park in Wimbledon Common neighborhood was popular with the locals. There were always a lot of people there during the daytime, mostly parents with children and dog walkers. Despite this, because of the large area and the abundance of greenery, it was always possible to get away from prying eyes and enjoy nature and solitude. Unfortunately, there was a downside to this. At about 10:30 a.m., a woman walking in the park noticed a gruesome scene. A young woman was lying on the ground. There was a lot of blood around, and a small child was sitting next to her. The victim was Rachel. Several dozen police officers arrived on the scene. They had to cordon off an area of 4 square kilometers where there were hundreds of potential witnesses and possibly the killer. Detectives soon realized that none of the park's visitors had seen either the moment of the attack or the killer himself. No one, except for one witness, Rachel's son, Alex. They were to get all the information from the 2-year-old boy. Of course, this was extremely difficult to do. The child was first admitted to the hospital for examination to make sure he was not injured. Later, the detectives did get some information from him. He said he and his mother were approached by a tall, thin, white man with brown hair. Everyone in that park was questioned. It took the police almost an entire day, but it only took a few hours for reporters to get the whole country to hear about this gruesome crime. Rachel's case instantly caused a wide resonance, which is not surprising. A young mother died in front of her child in one of the most popular parks in London. Residents of Britain were even more shocked when the newspapers leaked information from the pathologist's report. Rachel had been stabbed 49 times with a sharp object. There was enormous pressure on the Metropolitan Police. Society demanded that the sadist be caught and punished as quickly as possible, and detectives did indeed have to work at an accelerated pace. In the first few weeks, they interviewed 548 men, 32 of whom were even arrested for a short period of time, but all to no avail. The police simply had no leads. The only thing the experts were able to find was a tiny piece of organic material that they thought might be connected to the killer, but 1992 technology simply didn't allow them to study it. By September, investigators were left with no suspects, so they enlisted the help of Paul Britton, a renowned profiler, to compile a description of the killer. Here's what he came up with. He is a man in his late 20s to early 30s, most likely living alone. All of his hobbies are also socially unrelated. He's interested in knives and the occult and has sadistic fantasies. In addition, he lives near the park. At the request of the police department, this profile, along with the sketch, was shown on television. After that, they received at least 4 calls, all with the same matching name, Colin Francis Stagg. In addition to the fact that he fit the sketch, the police ran his name and realized that he had already been on their radar. The fact is that Stagg had tried to enter the park the day Rachel was killed. Colin Stagg, 27, had led a secluded lifestyle. He had lost his job and was struggling to find money to pay for housing and food. He had a dog that he walked every morning in Wimbledon Common Park. According to his testimony, on the day Rachel was killed, he went there with his dog, but because of a severe headache, he quickly went home and went to bed. Toward evening, he felt better and decided to take his dog out for a walk again. However, on this approach to the park, he was stopped by the police. Stagg calmly answered all questions and gave his details. The police had no evidence against Stagg, but he seemed to them to be a suitable candidate for the role of the killer. In addition, the press kept pressuring law enforcement agencies, and they needed a breakthrough in the case urgently. That same day, Stagg was brought to the police station, where he was held for 3 days. When questioned, he denied any involvement in the murder, but the detectives were beginning to believe more and more the opposite. First, occult books were found in his home, which coincided with the profiler's suggestion. Second, the police were able to find 2 women who gave some disturbing details about Stagg. One woman accused him of exposing himself in front of her in that very park. In his defense, Colin said he was just sunbathing in a secluded part of the park and the woman came there herself. Another woman reported that she had been exchanging intimate letters with him for some time. In one of them, he confessed to her that he dreamed of having sexual intercourse outdoors. All this was already enough for the police to consider Colin a pervert and finally believe his involvement in the murder of Rachel. Except they knew that all these circumstantial arguments would not stand a chance in court. For this reason, the man had to be released. On the advice of his lawyer, he agreed to pay a fine for exposing himself to a woman in the park, though he continued to insist on his innocence. Detectives, along with a profiler, came up with a very unusual plan that was supposed to help force a confession. A Metropolitan Police officer, under the pseudonym Lacey James, began writing Colin letters of intimate content. She said she knew the woman Stagg had corresponded with before. Despite the ridiculousness of the situation, the plan worked. Colin responded to all the letters, and each time their dialogues became more and more explicit and perverted. Lizzie played the part of a woman with violent and sadist hobbies, sometimes even illegal, and their communication lasted 5 months. All this time, Stagg insisted that they finally meet in person, and the detectives decided it might actually help to get a confession out. The location and date was set at a park. Lizzie didn't go there alone, but Stagg didn't know that. Plainclothes officers were keeping an eye on them in case the man decided to attack their colleague. During the conversation, Lizzie, on the provider's advice, shared with Colin a fictional story about her secret hobbies. She revealed that her ex-boyfriend was into the occult and that they performed a ritual sacrifice on a living person together. Stagg took this information rather calmly. At least he kept in touch with Lizzie, and they spent a few more hours together and parted ways. After that, they met a few more times, and finally, the police decided to move on to the final part. Walking in the park, Lizzie talked to Colin about Rachel's murder. She told him that she wished he had been the murderer because she was aroused by thoughts of the crime, but it didn't work. Stagg apologized to her and told her that he had nothing to do with the murder. Lizzie tried to get him to confess several more times, but he kept denying his involvement. It looked as if the police had botched a 6-month operation. They couldn't get any evidence that Stagg had killed Rachel, but the detectives were still convinced they were right. That's why they did arrest him in August 1993. At the interrogation, Colin was told all the cards and that all this time he had been in correspondence with a police officer. He was read excerpts from these letters describing various perversions and was also introduced to the real Lizzie herself. Stagg was shocked, but on the advice of his lawyer, refused to answer police questions. Investigators had hoped to the last that under such pressure he would confess to the murder, but he did not. All they had to do now was to take the case to trial. All this dragged on for a year, which Stagg spent in custody. When the case finally went to trial, his lawyers blew the prosecution's arguments to smithereens. Even the judge was forced to admit that the whole operation with Lizzie James was overkill and that the police had behaved in an extremely unprofessional manner. In September 1994, Colin was acquitted of all charges and released. Lizzie James later resigned from the police, citing serious psychological trauma from the operation. The police, who had spent more than £3 million on this investigation, were deadlocked. They had not a single suspect, and most of the detectives continued to think that Stagg was the murderer, and they were not alone in this opinion. The newspapers and the public continued to blame him for what happened. Every time he went out on the street, he caught the embittered looks of passerby. Almost the entire country believed that the murderer had gotten away with it, and this only added to the hatred towards Stagg. This went on for years. The Rachel Nichol case was finally hung in the balance, and the police made little effort to look for new suspects. Why, when they were all sure of Colin's involvement? By then, Rachel's husband, along with Alex, had gone to live in Europe for several reasons. First, he was constantly harassed by journalists, which reminded his son of his mother's murder. Secondly, the father felt it was not safe for his son to remain in London. He was the only person who saw the murderer. For a long time, no one knew which country they had moved to. Later, journalists did get wind that they lived in Spain and France. In 2000, Scotland Yard took up the case and assigned a new team to it. They studied all the collected material and witness statements, but they failed to find a new suspect. Only 3 years later, they announced that they had found DNA from an unknown man on Rachel's clothes. Analysis technology had only just matured to such a capability, and in 1992, such a discovery was simply impossible. Even in 2003, this tiny sample, which took experts 18 months to find, was not enough to establish identity. The data from that sample was only enough to rule out unsuitable people. And a year later, in 2004, the police finally had a new suspect. His DNA was already in the database, and a comparison with a sample from Rachel's clothes showed mixed results. That man was the 38-year-old Robert Napper, a convicted murderer and serial rapist who, at the time, had already spent 10 years in a halfway house. His biography is striking in two ways: the cruelty of his crimes and the ease with which he evaded justice. Later, because of this, the police would face a wave of outrage from the public. Napper first came into the hands of law enforcement in 1986. He was then given a suspended sentence for assault with an air gun. In 1989, he broke into a young mother's house and abused her. For the next 4 years, there was a series of similar attacks, but the police did not tie them together and could not reach the suspect. What followed was something truly amazing. Napper confessed to his mother that he had carried out all these attacks. She called the police and told them everything. And what do you think? They found no connection between the crimes and the woman's story, so they didn't look into Napper's involvement. The only thing the mother could do was convince her son to see a psychiatrist. When Napper came back from there, he said that the specialist thought he was crazy, but took no further action. A short time later, he assaulted and abused a woman and her child in Crystal Palace Park. This happened just weeks before Rachel's murder, but again, the police failed to see the connection. This was by no means the only such attack in Crystal Palace Park, and police at some point figured out that one man was committing the crimes. From the words of witnesses, they compiled a sketch of him. After the publication in the newspapers, several of Napper's neighbors contacted the detectives. They all pointed to the man, and the police called Napper for a blood sample. He simply ignored the request, and the detectives did not go looking for him. They simply forgot about him. In November 1993, London was rocked by another high-profile crime, which, as it later turned out, was also committed by Napper. A young mother, Samantha Bissett, was attacked in her room. In addition, the perpetrator did not spare her young daughter. What he did to them shocked even experienced detectives. The police photographer who arrived on the scene could not return to work for several months because of the shock of what he saw. Remarkably, the same profiler who had been brought in to investigate Rachel's murder worked on all of these cases, and he believed that all of these attacks had nothing to do with each other. The detectives also saw no possible connection to the Rachel case because they were 100% sure that Colin Stagg was guilty. The team of investigators handling the attack at Crystal Palace Park also saw no connection. Napper was nearly 190 centimeters tall, and based on witness testimony, the perpetrator was shorter. But the maniac made one mistake in the attack on Samantha Bissett. He left a fingerprint in her apartment that allowed his identity to be run through the database. Napper had previously been fingerprinted after he stalked a woman in the street. He was not arrested until May 1994. When questioned, he denied guilt and was extremely calm. In his apartment, they found maps of London on which the locations of the attacks and murders were circled, including the place where Rachel was murdered. They also found several notes on how to properly abuse women. Shortly before that, police found a knife in the very park where Rachel was murdered. The fingerprints on the handle matched Napper's, but even that wasn't enough to make detectives consider him for the killer because they were still convinced Colin Stagg was guilty. Napper, however, was still considered a suspect in Rachel's murder for a while, but those charges were quickly dropped. The thing is that Napper said he was at work that day. In 1995, Napper went on trial for the murder of Samantha and her daughter. The prosecution struck a deal with him in which he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and the court sent him to a closed psychiatric hospital instead of prison. The fact was that Napper had been diagnosed with a number of disorders, including Asperger's syndrome and schizophrenia. Because of this, the maniac could have avoided prison anyway, with or without a confession. As a result, the judge sent him to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital for treatment, with no time limit. Later, detectives wanted to question him about Rachel's murder, but the doctors forbade it. They feared it might aggravate Napper's mental status. Back to 2004, the new team of detectives on the Rachel Nicholl case finally began to take a closer look at Napper as a suspect. After they compared his DNA to a small sample found on the young woman's body, the results were very mixed. That sample wasn't enough to confirm the similarity. It was only enough to rule out other suspects. In Napper's case, the results did not do with 100% certainty. Investigators kept digging further using new technology. On Rachel's clothing, they managed to spot a microscopic piece of paint. Experts examined it and concluded that it matched the paint on Napper's iron toolbox. Prior to his arrest, he worked as a storekeeper for the Department of Defense. It is not entirely clear how he could have gotten a job there with his set of mental disorders, but the fact remains, he combined assault and murder with his day job. It took Scotland Yard 3 years to prepare this case for trial, and in 2007, Napper was charged with the murder of Rachel Nicholl. During the first hearing, he pleaded not guilty, which prolonged the trial for almost a year. In the end, Napper agreed the same deal he had been offered 12 years earlier, a change of plea to manslaughter in exchange for a confession. On December 18, 2008, 16 years after the murder, he finally confessed. For Napper himself, the verdict did not change anything. He was left in the same hospital under heavy guard. Most likely, he will never be released. But the news made a lot of noise all over Britain. The police suffered the most, fixating on Colin Stagg and completely ignoring on Colin Stagg and other serious leads. Instead, the investigation was divided into 3 separate lines. Each team of detectives looked for different criminals, while behind all the attacks and murders was Napper. That same year, 2008, Stagg sued the police department for £706,000, a record for Britain for unwarranted criminal prosecutions. The Metropolitan Police also issued a public apology to him. He subsequently wrote several books about his life experiences. In them, he described what it was like to be accused of murder. Stagg admitted that for 10 years, his life was effectively ruined by journalists and the police. After the whole of Britain finally believed in his innocence, he decided to spend all the compensation on travel, expensive cars, and other things that brought him joy. In 2010, a special commission issued a report criticizing the actions of homicide detectives. This document was called a catalog of wrong decisions and mistakes. And the reason for this is not only the fact that the murder could not be solved for 16 years. The whole point is that if the police had done their job properly, they could have arrested Napper before he killed Rachel, Samantha, and her daughter. No disciplinary action followed, however. All the detectives involved in the case retired, and one of the lead investigators passed away. As for Rachel's son, Alex, he did not give his first interview until 2017, 25 years after the incident. He said that growing up without his mother had been problematic, but that he had found the strength to let go and move on. Shortly before the interview, he went to the very place where his mother was murdered, and in that moment, he was able to finally let go of the heavy weight of the past. One can only hope that this story, like others like it, will serve as a lesson for law enforcement agencies around the world. It is too late to speculate about whether or not the police could have saved Rachel and Samantha, but it is never too late to draw conclusions and prevent future crimes. Shauna Tiafe was born on March 13, 1966, in Salt Lake City, USA. She was a cheerful and energetic woman, a member of the school cheerleading team, and had many friends. After completing her education, Shauna worked for some time in her home state, but at the age of 29, she decided to move to Las Vegas. She liked the vibrant pace of the city, which offered many more opportunities to earn money. After moving, Shauna worked as a cosmetic salesperson in several elite firms, but in 2001, she decided to become a waitress at the Palms Casino. At that time, the establishment had just opened, but it quickly became one of the most popular casinos in Vegas. It was at this job that Shauna met her future husband, George. He often visited the casino, and a romance quickly developed between them. A year after they met, the couple had a daughter, Madison. A few years later, they officially got married. It seemed that this family had a happy and carefree future ahead of them. George worked as a firefighter, paid a lot of attention to his wife and daughter, and always took care of them. Shauna worked at the casino, earning quite decent money there. But in 2008, their relationship began to deteriorate. Due to the financial crisis, George lost a considerable portion of his savings, which were invested in real estate. On this basis, he became nervous and irritable, increasingly venting his anger on his wife and daughter. Eventually, the woman decided that they should live separately for some time and moved into her own apartment. The couple went to a family psychologist, but no improvements were observed in their relationship, and they increasingly discussed divorce. Another blow to Shauna was that her apartment was robbed. While she was at work, several valuable items were taken from her home, including her engagement ring. But a strange separate detail was that the thief also took her panties, leaving men's underwear in the apartment. The woman reported the incident to the police, but they could not identify the perpetrator. On the morning of September 29, 2012, 3 weeks after the incident, George picked up his daughter from her grandmother and went to Shauna's apartment to retrieve some of the girl's belongings. They continued to share custody of their daughter, and she was supposed to spend a few days with him. As they approached the apartment, they saw that the garage door was open. When they entered the apartment, they were met with a gruesome sight. Shauna was lying on the floor, blood everywhere. Her 8-year-old daughter witnessed a horrific scene. George immediately called the police and reported what had happened. The 911 operator asked them to go outside with the woman and wait for the officers. Investigators began to study the crime scene and determined that Shauna was likely attacked near the stairs on the second floor of the apartment. The house was in complete chaos. Many things were scattered and broken, indicating a struggle between the victim and the perpetrator. Medical experts found serious injuries on Shauna's body and initially thought that her death may have been caused by a gunshot wound. However, they soon realized that all these injuries were inflicted by a heavy, blunt object, most likely a hammer. After interviewing neighbors, the police received 2 leads between 3:30 and 4 a.m. One of the residents in the same building heard some noise from the woman's apartment. He didn't pay much attention to it because he knew that Shauna was coming home from work at that time. Another neighbor found her phone, documents, and cosmetics on a nearby street, which indicated that the perpetrator either intentionally threw them away while fleeing the apartment or accidentally dropped them. Investigators reconstructed the timeline of events that night. On surveillance cameras at the casino and its parking lot, they saw Shauna finishing her shift and leaving for the parking lot. Nothing on the footage indicated that the woman was alarmed or in any danger. Detectives concluded that the killer was likely already in her apartment when she returned home. As usual, the first suspicion fell on her husband, George. The police have already found out that the couple was getting ready for a divorce. They also talked to Shauna's friends and learned about the problems in their relationship. Everything looked as if he really fit the role of the killer. However, the detective found that the man had an unquestionable alibi for that night. He was on a 12-hour shift at the fire department. This was confirmed by all his colleagues and camera recordings. Thus, the police did not have any serious clues. They immediately learned that the woman's apartment was robbed 3 weeks earlier and tried to understand if there was any connection between these events. The version was being developed that the robber might have returned, but did not have time to leave the house before Shauna arrived. A struggle broke out between them, and he killed her. Meanwhile, the victim's sister continued to suspect George in what had happened. She was constantly talking to Shauna and knew about all the problems in their relationship, about his constant jealousy and scandals. However, his alibi was unquestionable. Therefore, the police focused on searching for other clues. A day after the discovery of the body, they received the first serious lead. By that time, the killer was being talked about in all the local news, which drew the attention of Vegas residents. A man who knew a homeless person called Greyhound turned to the police. He told this witness that he killed the woman with a hammer. According to the man, Greyhound talked about it with joy and even laughed. Given that the details of the murder were not disclosed in the media, this lead became key for the detectives. They found out that the witness lived in a tent on the outskirts of the city and often met with Greyhound near the Albertsons store. Together with him, they went there and started waiting. Very soon, the witness saw him and reported to the police, who immediately approached the suspect. During the search, they found banned substances on him, which allowed them to arrest Greyhound. In the police station, the officers found out that his real name was Noel Stevens. He had been repeatedly convicted of petty thefts and possession of various substances, but the man denied his involvement in the murder, and the investigators really doubted his candidacy as a suspect. First, he only committed minor offenses, and it was difficult to imagine why this homeless person would kill someone. Secondly, he lived practically at the other end of the city, which made the choice of the victim completely incomprehensible. It took him several hours to get to Shauna's house, while many really valuable things in her apartment were untouched, including cash. None of this made any sense. However, the police continued to investigate his involvement. They found a tent where Stevens lived and conducted a search. The tent was located outside the city in a remote desert area. While examining the area around it, investigators found several significant pieces of evidence. Just a few meters away, they discovered the suspect's pants and underwear covered in blood, as well as a hammer tag. Later, experts determined that the blood belonged to Shauna TFA. However, the main clue was waiting for them at the police station. By gaining access to Noel's smartphone, they found only one contact in his notebook: George TFA's number. At this point, the case took an unexpected turn. From conversation with Shauna's friends and relatives, investigators learned that George had been friends with a homeless man for several years, whom he entrusted with various household and yard work. The woman often complained about him to her acquaintances when he came to fix something. According to her, he behaved strangely and even creepily, but George never took her concerns seriously. Thus, detectives found the missing link between the killer and the victim. But the main question remained whether George had any involvement in this, or if Stevens chose the woman as a victim simply because he knew Shauna and her work schedule. With the help of the hammer tag, the police found out when and where the hammer, which was most likely the murder weapon, was purchased. By requesting surveillance camera footage, they were shocked to see Stevens and George TFA walking into the store and buying the same hammer. At this point, investigators realized that Shauna's husband could indeed be the mastermind behind this horrific murder. When all this evidence was presented to Stevens, he finally decided to confess to what he had done. The man admitted that he did indeed kill Shauna, but only on the orders of her husband. According to Stevens, George paid him $600 for it. They had been planning this crime for several months. The man bought dark clothes for Stevens and gave him a duplicate of the keys to her apartment. 3 weeks before the murder, he asked the homeless man to break into her house and stage a robbery so that later the police would be confused and conduct their investigation along that line. On the night of the murder, Stevens snuck into her apartment again and waited for the woman to come home. After she arrived and began to walk up to the second floor, he came out of his hiding place and attacked her. Stevens said he struck her about 17 times, causing the hammer to break. The killer agreed to show detectives the location near a campsite where he buried his weapon. With Stevens' confession and a multitude of evidence, the police charged George. His relatives were shocked because he had always been a caring and loving family man who helped people. Upon learning of the accusations, George's sister called him and told him that he was suspected of murder. Immediately after the call, he got into his pickup truck and tried to leave town. However, at the exit, the man crashed into a fence and flew off the road. The police who arrived at the scene concluded that he deliberately caused the accident in an attempt to take his own life, and there were no tire marks on the path of the car. George did not even try to brake, but only pressed on the gas pedal. However, he did not succeed in his goal. With medium injuries, the man was taken to the local hospital. 2 days later, the police informed him that he was arrested for murder. George's reaction was very calm. He asked to contact his lawyer and also to allow him to take a shower and brush his teeth. From that moment on, the police department began preparing to transfer the case to court. 3 months later, Noel Stevens agreed to make a full confession in exchange for a waiver of the death penalty. George TFA refused to admit his guilt, and the trial against him only began 3 years later in August 2015. At the hearings, he did not utter a word, entrusting all the work to his lawyer. His relatives acted as witnesses and spoke about how George could never have done such a thing to his wife and could not be involved in her murder. His defense was based on the fact that Stevens killed Shauna on his own initiative, and her husband knew nothing about it. According to the lawyer, the store camera footage did not prove anything. It only showed how George and Noel were buying tools that the latter needed for housework. The prosecution did not believe in such a scenario. In court, they presented a printout of George's phone calls, according to which the man called Stevens 87 times in September 2012, 5 of which were made shortly before the murder. Based on Stevens' testimony, the prosecution concluded that money was the motive for the murder. George lost a significant portion of his savings due to the crisis, resulting in Shauna becoming the main breadwinner in the family. She earned over $100,000 a year, while George's income was only half that amount. He realized that in the event of a divorce or property division, he would be left with nothing, so he decided to get rid of his wife. Stevens initially didn't believe him when he spoke about the murder. Prior to this, they had been friends for several years, and Noel had actually done various work around the house and property for a small fee. In the end, George offered him $5,000 to kill his wife, and he agreed. According to his testimony, the man planned to get this money from an insurance company after Shauna's death. Despite Stevens revealing all the details of the murder and how he and George planned the crime, there were certain difficulties during the trial. The results of Stevens' medical examination were presented during the hearing, which showed that the man often suffered from visual and auditory hallucinations and regularly took potent banned substances. He did not deny either of these points, so all his words were questioned by the defense lawyer. Because of this, neither side was sure of the outcome when the jurors began to deliberate. It took them 3 days. In the end, George TFA was found guilty of conspiring to commit murder. When the judge pronounced these words, George showed no emotion. He was sentenced to life in prison with an additional 81 years for the remaining charges, including conspiracy to break into a home and robbery. Soon after the verdict, George filed a 107-page appeal in which he confessed to the crime in the third person. He wrote that prescription drugs had clouded his mind, causing him to be unable to distinguish between good and evil. All of this led him to believe that killing his wife would be the only way to protect their child. George revealed that he had suffered a serious injury several years before the murder, but the court did not appoint a psychological examination for him. Despite this, in 2017, the court rejected his appeal because there was no reason to doubt that his mental state prevented him from clearly understanding what was happening. Since George's arrest, their daughter has been living with her maternal grandmother and has been actively helped by her sister Shauna. At one point, this girl lost both of her parents and learned what a monster her father was. He deliberately took her to the apartment, knowing in advance what she would see. Obviously, he did this to provide a more reliable alibi without caring about the consequences for his child's mental health. As for Stevens, he received a 42-year prison sentence, Considering that this man spent most of his life on the streets, it would be foolish to consider such a sentence as punishment. Karen Slover was born on October 27, 1972, in the American city of Decatur, Illinois. After high school, she attended Richland Community College, where she met her future husband, Michael Slover. After college, they married in 1992, and less than a year later, their son Colton was born. The couple had to work hard to support their child and cover their own expenses. For this reason, Karen had to go back to work for a few days after giving birth. Michael's parents agreed to take care of the child, and he spent most of his working days with them. In the following years, Karen changed several jobs until she settled on the local newspaper. She worked in the advertising department, quickly found common ground with the team, and generally loved her job. A few years after their son's birth, the relationship between the couple began to deteriorate. Karen complained to friends that Michael often lost his temper and hit her during arguments. For this reason, she decided to file for divorce, and the court awarded her custody of Colton. However, she could not afford to hire a nanny for her child since her salary at the newspaper would not cover it. Michael's parents agreed to continue taking care of him while she was at work. After the divorce, she began dating a man named David Swan. They lived separately but saw each other regularly. Swan got along well with her son, and there were no serious problems in their relationship with Karen. In 1996, when her son was already 3 years old, Karen began to think about moving to another city and trying herself as a model. She started looking for suitable vacancies and soon received an invitation from a major modeling company in the state of Georgia. She had been eagerly awaiting the move, but continued to work at the editorial office until the last minute in order to save up money for herself and her son for the first time. On September 27th, Karen left work around 5 p.m., telling her colleagues that she was going to pick up Colton from his grandparents and go to the shopping center with him. The woman planned to attend the wedding of her acquaintance and wanted to buy a suitable dress, but that evening, Karen never picked up her son. Several hours passed and the woman was still missing. She also did not contact her former husband's parents or anyone else. Around 10 p.m. that evening, a patrol officer noticed a suspicious car on the shoulder of Highway 72 near the town of Champaign. The driver's door was open, the headlights were on, and the engine was running. At first, the officer thought that the car had some problems and the driver was trying to fix them. However, as he approached closer, he discovered that there was no one inside the car or nearby. Inside the car, the police found a woman's purse with Karen's documents, a half-eaten chocolate bar, and a package of food from a cafe. Everything looked as if the woman had just left the car and was about to return soon, but she was nowhere to be found. The officer ran the car's license plates and found that it was registered to David Swan. Contacting him, he learned that the man had lent his car to Karen while her car was being repaired. He explained that the woman was supposed to pick up her son from her grandparents that evening, and investigators headed to their home. Meanwhile, the car was taken to the police station, where the forensic experts studied it more closely. Karen's former husband's parents said that the woman was supposed to come right after work, but she never showed up all day. Colton was still there, and his mother could not just leave him without warning. The police began to suspect that the woman may have been abducted or that the car theft did not go as planned. Detectives immediately noticed that the location where the car was found did not match the timeline of events that evening. Karen left the office and headed to her former husband's parents' house before going to the store in Forsyth. Her car was found almost 60 kilometers away. This suggested that the car may have been left there by a criminal who wanted to confuse investigators. The woman herself could not have ended up near another city, as she needed to pick up her son and prepare for a wedding that was supposed to take place the next day. While experts tried to find any clues in the car, such as fingerprints, detectives decided to question employees of stores, hairdressers, and beauty salons in Forsyth. The next day, they went there showing them photos of Karen, but no one had seen her. Forensic experts could not find fingerprints in the car, but something seemed strange to them. On the passenger seat, they found traces of cement and ash. David Swan stated that they were not there when he gave the car to his girlfriend. In addition, several stalks of tall grass were found in the salon, which also raised questions. The car was on the side of the road, along which there was no such vegetation. Moreover, several scattered coins were found in the car, but it did not give them any serious leads. Upon learning of Karen's disappearance, her relatives, colleagues, and friends participated in large-scale searches. Some groups combed the area around the road where her car was found, while others distributed leaflets throughout the city. The management of the newspaper where the woman worked offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help find her, but all of this did not yield any results. On October 1st, a distressing call came to the police. Fishermen noticed a garbage bag on the shore of Lake Shelbyville, located 50 kilometers from Decatur. It seemed strange to them that someone had left garbage in such a deserted place, so they decided to take it with them to throw away. Later, however, men quickly realized that it was far from garbage. The bag was tightly wrapped in tape and weighed quite a lot, so the fishermen decided to check its contents. To their horror, they saw a woman's head inside. Investigators immediately thought that the victim could be Karen, so they requested her dental records to establish her identity. Their fears were confirmed. The head did indeed belong to her. Meanwhile, police officers and divers searched the lake and soon found several more bags with other parts of Karen's body. Medical experts concluded that the woman died from 7 gunshot wounds, after which an unknown perpetrator dismembered her body using something like a gasoline saw and distributed it in bags. In each of them, there was an additional piece of concrete block to add weight. Detectives assumed that the killer threw the packages from a bridge over the lake. They even managed to find fingerprints on the railings, but these samples were not enough for comparison. In the following days, several more packages surfaced and washed up on the shore, but the police still failed to find all parts of the victim's body. Considering the brutality with which Karen was killed, investigators made a logical conclusion that the perpetrator was likely someone who hated the victim and therefore knew her well. This explained why the criminal fired a total of 7 shots. Based on this, they began looking for possible suspects among her close acquaintances. Friends of the woman told detectives that her ex-husband sometimes beat Karen and often threatened her during their arguments. This immediately aroused suspicions among the investigators, and they decided to question him. Michael said he had been at work all day, as he worked in 3 different places as a security guard at a grocery store, a karate instructor, and a bouncer at a bar. The man finished his shift at the store around 3 p.m., then went straight to the gym where he worked out. After that, he went home, took a shower, and immediately left for work at the bar. Investigators carefully checked his story, but the man really had a solid alibi for the whole day. Many people at all 3 of his workplaces saw him, and detectives specifically highlighted the time frame when Karen left work and when they found her car. Michael had a serious alibi for the whole day, so he was no longer considered a suspect. After that, detectives turned their attention to Karen's boyfriend, and here, everything turned out to be much more interesting. It turned out that David Swan had previously been arrested for assault and had also posed as a police officer. Moreover, the guy had some mental problems which led him to be sent to a psychiatric hospital. After his girlfriend disappeared, he actively participated in the search efforts and did not miss any opportunity to talk to reporters and give interviews. The police considered such behavior slightly suspicious, as David tried to attract as much attention to himself as possible. They suspected that this was the way the man was trying to deflect suspicion, which often happens if the killer is someone close to the victim. This person may be more active than anyone else in the media, calling on the police to find the culprit and generally staying at the center of the investigation. In addition, David misled his friends about his relationship with Karen. He told them that they were going to get married soon, but her friends said the couple had only been dating for a month, and Karen wasn't even thinking about marriage at this stage. Investigators also found out that David owned a chainsaw, which he sometimes used to butcher deer after hunting. Given that Karen's body was dismembered in a similar way, this only strengthened suspicions against him. In addition, the man owned a gun of the same caliber that was used to kill the victim, but the main snag was with his alibi. On the evening of the woman's disappearance, David was supposed to attend his acquaintance's wedding as a chauffeur, but he was very late for the event. As a result, the man had no alibi for about 45 minutes, which coincided with the time of Karen's murder. Taking into account all the above, the detectives were almost certain that he was the killer. The man was questioned for about 4 hours, trying to get a confession out of him. When he began to list literally every action he took that evening, the police heard something interesting. David said he withdrew money from an ATM, and the investigators immediately requested footage from the camera of the machine. To their surprise, this story was confirmed. David did withdraw money at the time that filled the gap in his alibi. The man physically could not have killed Karen and driven the car to another city, so all suspicions were lifted from him. At this point, the detectives had essentially run out of leads. They took one more step that could help them find the killer over time. Tall grass, like the kind found in Karen's car, was often found on abandoned or outlying plots of land. In the city itself, it was constantly mowed down as required by law. The police walked around the outskirts of the city and talked to local residents, asking them to report any strange things they might have seen in this area. The detectives continued to question Karen's relatives and acquaintances in an effort to find new suspects. They found out that the woman had not gotten along with her former mother-in-law, and the relationship had been quite tense at times. Jeanette Slover was very attached to her grandson and did not want to give him up, even to his own mother. Karen sometimes had to forcefully take Colton from their home, and it seemed that Jeanette considered the boy to be her own child rather than her grandchild. But the strangest discovery was yet to come. The police found out that Jeanette had occasionally breastfed Colton. The investigators decided to take a closer look at Slover and spoke with them again. Jeanette claimed that she had been at home with her grandson all day and had tried to call Karen on their home phone when she didn't show up at the appointed time, but the woman didn't answer. The police requested data on calls from their home and found that Slover had never called Karen that day, but instead, their phone had made multiple outgoing calls to their son Michael's number. Karen's former father-in-law told the police that he had left home for less than an hour that evening to buy toys for Colton at a local store. The investigators decided to check this information and found out that the store had never sold toys from that manufacturer. What was even more suspicious was that the man was absent around the same time that Karen was killed. The detectives began to seriously consider Slover's involvement and even identified a possible motive. The victim was planning to move to another state to work as a model, and her son would have gone with her. Considering how attached Jeanette was to Colton, she theoretically could have gone to murder to keep him from being taken away from her. The investigators also found out that Slover had an automotive business. They owned a large plot of land converted into a parking lot for used cars, but it had been practically unused for several years. When the police obtained a search warrant and arrived there, they discovered that the area was littered with broken concrete blocks, just like the ones that had been found in bags with parts of Karen's body. However, the investigators could not confirm that these were the same blocks. In addition, they could not find any evidence and Slover themselves refused to continue the dialogue with the police and hired a lawyer. At that moment, the investigation had stalled because there were no other leads for the detectives. It was only resumed 2 years later, in 1998, when a new team of detectives decided to re-examine the area where Slover's business was located. They believed that Karen may have been killed there and that some evidence must have been left behind. As for the Slover family themselves, they had all moved to another state during that time. Michael's sister, Mary, had set up Colton and he was living with them. Before the move, they had hired workers to carry out repairs on the business premises. This raised even more suspicions, but without any solid evidence, the detectives were powerless. For the second search in 1998, the investigators enlisted the help of a forensic expert and also sought assistance from the local military base's leadership. They needed as many people as possible to comb through every inch of the area. Over the next 6 months, they collected and sifted through the top layer of soil, searched for traces of blood on every stone until they finally bore fruit. They found a button and rivets from the jeans that Karen was wearing on the day of the murder. Later, they found another button, this time from her blouse. This confirmed the police's theory that the woman's body could have been dismembered and placed in packages on the business premises. The detectives believed that Jeanette, along with her husband, was involved in this, while their daughter Mary was left to babysit Colton. According to their version of events, Jeanette personally shot Karen when she came to pick up her son, after which she and her husband took her body to their business premises. However, the buttons alone were not enough to hold her accountable. The police interviewed all the people who lived near the site and learned that Karen's ex-husband was mowing the grass on the evening after the murder. This only reinforced the investigators' version, according to which Michael not only knew about the crime, but also helped his parents cover up their tracks. Moreover, this confirmed that the site was covered with tall grass, just like Karen's car. Apparently, Jeanette and her husband drove the car away from the city to confuse the investigators, and the grass could have ended up in the car with them. Another witness reported that the Slovers were burning something on the premises on the day of the murder. According to detectives, this is how they got rid of the evidence. But that wasn't all. The most shocking piece of evidence that truly shocked the detectives was found in the packages where they discovered parts of Karen's body. A small black hair was found on the tape used to wrap one of the packages. It turned out to belong to a dog, and Slover happened to have a black Labrador. The detectives obtained a warrant and took hair samples from the Slover's dog brush. DNA analysis showed a complete match, which only strengthened the case against the entire family. Once the police took the brush for analysis, Jeanette and her husband did something that further convinced everyone of their involvement. They immediately put their dog to sleep, apparently fearing they could be accused of the murder through the dog, but they didn't know it was already too late. Gathering all of this evidence together, the police arrested Jeanette, her husband, and son on January 27, 2000. All three were charged with murder, but the family continued to deny any involvement. The case was then brought to trial, which didn't conclude until 2002. Despite all of the evidence and witness testimonies, the jury found them guilty. Michael and his father received 65 years in prison each, while Jeanette received 60 years. In 2003, they attempted to appeal the verdict, but their request was denied by the court. It seemed like the end of the story, but not for Karen's son, who still had to go through some trials of his own. As I mentioned earlier, he was adopted by Michael's sister, Mary. The court made this decision despite Karen's parents also fighting for custody rights. When Mary's relatives were accused of murder, a logical question arose. Did the woman know that her family members had committed the crime? If she knowingly stayed behind to look after Colton while her mother and father got rid of the body, It would make her an accomplice, but it was practically impossible to prove. Karen's parents still went to court, demanding that Mary be stripped of her parental rights and that they be given custody of that boy. A year later, in 2003, the judge ruled in their favor, and Colton remained living with his maternal grandparents. During this process, it was revealed that Mary hated Karen and even told acquaintances several times that she wished her dead. Additionally, the court found that she had tried to make the boy forget about his biological mother in every way possible. At the moment, the whole trio is still serving their punishment. Jeanette will be eligible for early release in 2029 when she will be over 80 years old, while her husband and son will be able to be released after 2030. To this day, they insist on their innocence and try to challenge the verdict, but all these attempts lead to nothing. Amy Blount was born on October 1, 1969, in Homestead, Florida. She grew up in a loving family and had many friends, largely due to her cheerful and kind nature. When she was 14 years old, her father passed away. Despite this painful loss, Amy found the strength to maintain a positive outlook on life. After high school, she enrolled at Flagler College, located in St. Augustine, near Jacksonville. Although it was home to only 13,000 people, it was the oldest city in the USA. It was founded by Spanish explorers, so many architectural elements still differ dramatically from the familiar American things. Amy loved studying at college, and in 3 years, she made many friends there. By that time, she was 21 years old and had only a little left before graduation. On November 6, 1990, her friend Kim came to St. Augustine, and they decided to go to a local bar popular among students. Amy's roommate and best friend, Kelly, also went with them. The young women had a great time enjoying the long-awaited meeting. At some point, their mutual acquaintance, Sean Nolan, joined them. He and Amy had mutual sympathy, but they were not in a relationship. In the evening, Kelly said that she felt sick and went back to the dorm, and a little later, Kim also left, leaving Sean and Amy alone. The next morning, the young women had to go to classes. However, when Kelly woke up, she found that Amy's bedroom door was wide open. She was not there. It seemed strange to her, but she decided that she would see Amy in class. However, the young woman never showed up. Kelly and Kim were worried about her absence and decided to talk to Sean, who stayed with her at the bar the night before. The guy worked at a place near the college, and the young women went to see him. His story seemed strange to them at first. He said that he had had a strong hangover and it was difficult for him to remember the chronology of that night. After gathering his thoughts, he finally told them that after the bar, he and Amy went towards the beach to take a walk, but soon they decided to go home. The guy called a taxi from the nearest payphone, and while they were waiting for the car, he and Amy had an argument. In the end, she went on foot to the dorm, which was only a few minutes away. Kelly was upset that the guy left Amy alone and didn't walk her to her dorm. At the same time, she became even more worried. Amy had nowhere else to go but the dorm, but she never showed up in her room. Her friend was afraid that something bad had happened to her and began to seriously suspect Sean. His strange behavior only heightened her anxiety. It seemed like the guy was not at all worried that Amy had disappeared. Kelly decided to continue her search and went to the university campus, asking all her acquaintances if they had seen Amy. The answer was the same. No one had met her that day and no one knew where she could be. At around 6 p.m., her friend decided to call the police. She informed investigators about the young woman's disappearance, and they began to check the information. They called all local hospitals, but no one resembling Amy had been admitted. The taxi operators were also contacted, but none of the drivers had picked up the young woman. That night, the police could not find any evidence that Amy had been in trouble or become a victim of a crime. Moreover, at the time, the young woman was already 21 years old, so they did not officially declare her missing, despite her friend's requests. By that time, Kelly was 100% sure that something bad had happened to Amy. Realizing that she could not convince the police to start searching, she decided to call Amy's mother. Later, the young woman admitted that it was the hardest call of her life. The next morning, Amy's sister arrived in St. Augustine to participate in the search. The first thing they did was go to the police station, where they received the same response. They couldn't start an investigation because there was no indication of a threat to life. The investigators believed that the young woman had simply left for a couple of days without warning. So the sisters, along with Kelly and other friends of the missing young woman, decided to organize their own search operation. They printed flyers with information about Amy and began posting them all over the city. Soon, a local television channel came to their aid, spreading information about the young woman's disappearance. All of this led to a large number of volunteers offering to participate in the search. They split into groups and began combing both the city and the surrounding area. Volunteers searched forests, beaches, abandoned houses, but they were unable to find any clues. This continued for 3 days until the police finally decided to start an investigation. By that time, the whole town was talking about Amy's disappearance, apparently putting pressure on the local police department and forcing them to take action. The first thing they decided to do was to talk to Sean, as he was the last person to see Amy, and here they encountered the first suspicious moment. The guy told them a story that was different from the one Kelly and Kim heard. Sean said that he and Amy left the bar and headed towards the beach, but on the way, they decided to split up and go home. He approached the payphone and called a taxi, but when he turned around, Amy was nowhere to be seen. After waiting for some time, he got in the taxi and went home. Investigators found this story strange. How could a young woman disappear from the street in a matter of seconds, and Sean, who was standing a meter away from her, not notice? Moreover, why did he give his friends a different version of events? All of this was enough to start considering Sean as a suspect. Detectives decided to verify his story and find the taxi driver who was supposed to take him home that night, and soon they succeeded. The only problem was that his story also differed from the two versions told by Sean. The driver claimed that he did indeed pick up the young man near the phone booth. However, when he arrived at the location, Sean was sleeping on a bench and the taxi driver had to wake him up. There was no young woman present at the time. On one hand, this provided the boy with an alibi, but on the other hand, he had, for some reason, shared his version of what had happened, which only raised suspicion with the detectives. Despite this, there was no evidence against him, so the police continued to search for new leads. 10 days had passed since Amy's disappearance. During that time, there had been no activity on her bank accounts, which only confirmed that she had not left on her own initiative. By that time, the residents of St. Augustine and the police began to suspect that Amy's disappearance might be related to another series of gruesome crimes, which we have a separate video about. In August of the same year, an unknown maniac killed 5 students in the city of Gainesville, which was 120 kilometers away. People began to fear that this criminal had moved to their town and that they were all in mortal danger. Investigators contacted colleagues from Gainesville and began to compare the cases, but soon they realized that there were many inconsistencies. The Gainesville killer attacked students in their homes and left their bodies there. In Amy's case, the police didn't even know if she was still alive and what had happened to her. Furthermore, at the time of her disappearance, The police had already arrested a man who was highly likely to be the killer. Several serious pieces of evidence pointed to him. Therefore, soon the detectives stopped looking for a connection between that series of crimes and Amy's disappearance. Meanwhile, the police department offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help find Amy. They immediately received hundreds of tips, but most of them led nowhere. This happens in any case where authorities offer money for information. People come up with various stories, hoping to get an easy check. It was also about 6 potentially important leads. Witnesses reported seeing her in different parts of the city. Many of them added that she got into some cars. Out of all this, one call was much more interesting. A man reported seeing Amy in the city center on the night of her disappearance. A fairly old car, similar to a Chevrolet Camaro, pulled up to her. There were 2 men inside. After a brief conversation with them, Amy got into the passenger seat and they drove off. At that time, this was the most detailed lead in the hands of detectives. However, something in the witness's behavior made them suspicious. After the call, he agreed to come to the station, answered all the questions, and tried to help. But for some reason, the investigators treated him with suspicion. Detectives called it a police instinct and couldn't explain their doubts. They offered him to take a lie detector test to verify his testimony, and the man agreed. They asked him only 2 questions: whether he had anything to do with Amy's disappearance and whether he could take detectives to her. The witness answered negatively, and the polygraph operator did not detect any signs of lying. Thus, investigators understood that they finally had honest testimony that could help find Amy. The police began searching for all cars that fit the witness's description, establishing the identities of the drivers and checking their alibis for the night of the young woman's disappearance. All of this continued for several weeks, but the detective never managed to find a single potential suspect. Since then, there have been no leads in this case, but on January 1st, 2 months after Amy's disappearance, a disturbing call was made to the police. A man was walking his dog on the outskirts of St. Augustine. At some point, his dog noticed a pile of logs with bricks and started acting strangely, barking and pulling on the leash, trying to run there. The owner decided to see what had so upset his dog and was almost speechless when he saw a skeleton hand sticking out from under the pile. He immediately called the police, and investigators began to extract the body. Due to the high degree of decomposition, they were unable to quickly establish her identity, but one detail immediately caught their attention. The body was wearing a green shirt, just like Amy Blount on the night she disappeared. The body was wrapped in a sheet. Medical experts conducted a more detailed analysis and concluded that the deceased was a young woman. She had received 5 sharp object wounds indicated by cuts on her shirt. In addition, 2 serious abrasions were found on the body. Investigators suspected that the victim was Amy, so they immediately sent her dental records to experts, who soon confirmed that it was indeed her. Friends and relatives of the young woman were devastated by the news. They had hoped until the very end that Amy would return to them unharmed. Now the police had to investigate her murder. Along with the discovery of the body, they received their first lead. Amy had been partially buried and covered with logs on the outskirts of a large private property. Upon learning the name of the owner of this plot, they called him in for questioning. For understandable reasons, the man immediately became a suspect. However, after talking to him, the investigators began to doubt his involvement. First, it was a huge plot of land without a fence, and anyone could enter it. Secondly, there were 2 residential trailers on the property whose owners paid the landowner for rent. He added that he constantly had problems with one of the tenants. When they heard his name, the police were shocked. it was the same witness who had been polygraphed. The man was 22-year-old Timothy Getchell. The police immediately asked the trailer owner to let them search the residence while the man was not at home, and he agreed. The first thing the police saw was a sheet very similar to the one in which Amy's body was wrapped. Upon further search, they found long female hair stuck in the mechanism of a floor exercise machine. It was the same color as Amy's hair. In addition, using special chemicals, forensic experts discovered blood traces in the living room. A sheet of paper with the name Toby and a phone number was also found in the house. The landowner said that a guy with that name did often visit Timothy. The police allowed that this person might also be related to the murder and contacted him. Toby agreed to meet with the detectives and told them his story. According to Toby's words, on the night of Amy's disappearance, he and Timothy were driving around town, stopping at different bars. At some point, they saw Amy walking alone on the street. Timothy asked Toby to stop the car, got out, and approached the young woman. He invited her to join them, and she got into the car. Together, they went to Timothy's trailer and had a party. However, Toby's story started to sound strange, like a detective story. At first, he claimed that he just dropped off Amy and Timothy near the trailer and immediately left. Then he changed his version and said that he went inside with them, had a beer, then went to the bathroom and left immediately without going into the living room, and got into the car and left. Investigators doubted that he was completely honest with them. They didn't believe that Amy would go to the outskirts of the city with two unknown men at night. In the morning, she had to go to classes and was supposed to go to the dormitory right after the bar. It looked like Toby constructed his story in such a way that he couldn't be made an accomplice. Detectives did not rule out that Timothy and Toby might have actually abducted the young woman on the empty night street, but could not prove it yet. Moreover, Toby told something else. According to him, in the first week of the investigation, he saw flyers about Amy's disappearance and recognized her. Then he asked Timothy what happened that night. He claimed that he took the young woman to the city center and dropped her off there. After that, she approached another car and soon got into it. Toby told him that he should share this information with the police. Despite the fact that his story raised serious doubts, the police had enough evidence to arrest Timothy. They arrived at his house and the man came out with his hands raised. During the interrogation, he told the investigators the same story. When Toby left, he began to flirt with Amy, but she rejected him. Then he got angry and decided to take her back to the city. Considering that he did not have his own car, he took the owner of the land's pickup truck and drove her to the center, where Amy allegedly got into another car. But the detectives immediately realized that this was a lie. At that point, they already knew that the rental pickup truck had 3 flat and worn-out tires for many months. The investigators immediately told him about it, and Timothy became nervous. The detectives asked him, "Did you kill Amy?" And the man replied, "I don't know. It seems so." From that moment on, he began to talk about the events of that night. According to him, he didn't remember much of what happened. At some point, he tried to kiss Amy, and the next thing he remembers is her holding a knife. He allegedly got scared that she might attack him, so he tried to take the weapon away from her. After that, Timothy didn't remember anything, as if he had lost consciousness. According to him, this had happened to him before. He had completely lost some memories. When he came to, he found the knife in his hand and Amy lying on the floor, showing no signs of life. Scared, he decided to get rid of the body. Timothy went to the shed for the shovel and started digging a hole. He then wrapped Amy in a sheet and buried her there, covering the grave with logs and bricks. After that, he prayed to God and went to clean up the blood in the room. With his confession in hand, Timothy was charged with murder. No evidence was found against Toby, so he was only used as a witness. On July 15, 1991, a trial was held where the man planned to defend himself and receive a lesser punishment. He wanted to make it look like self-defense and use the story of memory loss. However, everything changed when the prosecutor addressed the judge and requested the death penalty. Almost immediately after that, Timothy stood up and said he was ready to confess to first-degree murder if the prosecution would drop the death penalty in favor of life imprisonment. After some brief consideration, the court agreed to these conditions, and Timothy was sentenced to life in prison. Amy's relatives and friends supported this decision. They all harbored hatred toward the person who took her away from them and wanted him to spend the rest of his life in a prison cell. As for Toby, no charges were ever brought against him. Nevertheless, his story still seems suspicious, and I wouldn't rule out the possibility that he was directly involved in the murder. Timothy remains behind bars to this day. He is currently 53 years old.